Chapter 1801. Han Fenglu's bamboo cane smashed down. It was like a blow to the head, full of power and unparalleled power. Bai Jian was aware of his current situation and did not dare to fight head-on. He immediately began to escape, not daring to stay in the slightest. He was now clear that if he fought Han Fenglu forcefully, he would be courting death. However, he also felt that it was a pity. He had just recovered some spiritual energy, but he had no choice but to waste it on escaping. It was truly unbearable. Under the pursuit, Han Fenglu realized that Bai Jian was like a slippery loach that could not be caught at all. Soon after, he tapped the bamboo cane in his hand, and an emerald light was emitted once again. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a dragon and surged towards Bai Jian. At that moment, Princess Mingzhu suddenly shouted. She held a sharp sword and wanted to kill Han Fenglu. From her point of view, if she could kill Bai Jian quickly, then she only needed to fight against Su Muhua. That way, she still had a chance of winning. Although the idea in his heart was good, the result was somewhat unsatisfactory. This was because Su Muhua seemed to have seen through the woman's thoughts and immediately blocked her path. "Your opponent is me." Su Muhua was still smiling. This was a battle that was certain to win, so he was not in a hurry and seemed to be in a leisurely mood. Su Muhua felt that this woman, who was now in the limelight, was rather interesting. He even wanted to know what kind of peerless face was under the veil. Princess Mingzhu could only sigh as she looked at Bai Jian, who was being chased. Since she could not help, she could only pray for her own good fortune. Soon after, the sharp sword also began to emit a golden light. However, compared to before, it was unknown how much dimmer it was. "You're just a lamp that's about to run out of oil. How dare you be so fierce?" Su Muhua shouted, then leaped up and punched down. Immediately, a majestic and irresistible fist intent swept out like a tidal wave. It could be said that it covered the sky and covered the earth. There was nowhere to escape. Princess Mingzhu brandished the sword in her hand. Immediately, countless sword intents gushed out and rushed toward the fist intents. However, the sound of shattering rang out one after another. The golden sword chi was simply unable to contend against the incomparably tyrannical fist intent. It was directly broken, unable to make any progress. Princess Mingzhu immediately dodged. Immediately, the fist intent came crashing down from all directions. Countless fist imprints appeared on the ground where she was originally standing. Every single fist created a deep crater. It was extremely terrifying. Floating in the air, Princess Mingzhu couldn't help but cough twice. The veil on her face was dyed even redder. Su Muhua raised her head to take a look. Then, like an arrow that had been released from a bow, she soared into the sky and charged over once again. In Su Muhua's opinion, as long as this woman was suppressed, the overall situation would be completely settled. At that time, it would be good if he could change the person. He wondered what it would be like to be the only daughter of the God Emperor. Bai Jian's escape was extremely embarrassing. However, his aura was considered stable, and there weren't too many twists and turns. However, he was soon entangled by the strange emerald flood dragon. He couldn't move at all. "Why don't you continue to run?" Han Fenglu sneered as he slowed down his footsteps when he saw this. Now that Bai Jian had been captured, it was a game of cat and mouse. They could take their time from now on. Die. Unrivaled God roared. He took a deep breath, gathered all the energy in his body, and thrust his spear forward. Now that they were in a situation where they were intimately interdependent, Unrivaled God couldn't just watch Bai Jian die. At this point, that was all he could do. As for the consequences, it wasn't something he could predict. As long as he could make some progress, everything would be fine. Seeing Unrivaled God's courage, Luo Rong forced himself to stand up as well. It was just a life and death struggle. Instead of waiting for death to come, he might as well fight with all his might. A mystic ice sword quietly appeared in his hand. Han Fenglu snorted when she sensed the explosive energy behind her. She ignored the restraint by Jian and charged straight at Unrivaled God. Since you still have some energy left, I'll destroy you completely. I'll destroy your last breath. Let's see if you can still be so fierce. Unrivaled God had no intention of retreating when he saw his opponent charging at him. He was staking everything on this one attack. As long as this spear could seriously injure him, it would be worth it. As for his own safety, that wasn't something he could consider at the moment. After all, he didn't have much time to think about it in this world. The long spear collided with the emerald green bamboo staff. An enormous force surged out of Unrivaled God's control, and he was sent flying. At the same time, the emerald bamboo staff flew out of his hand and hit Unrivaled God's chest. The bamboo staff flew back, while Unrivaled God fell to the ground. He coughed and spat out blood. In the next moment, Han Fenglu performed a hand seal and an emerald water dragon appeared again. The water dragon swam and coiled around Luo Rong. At the same time, the bamboo staff in his hand struck down. The mystic ice sword shattered immediately. Luo Rong's head was hit as well, and he fainted immediately. However, after the shards landed on the ground, a chill surged and froze the ground. Even Han Fenglu's feet were frozen. Han Fenglu looked down and snorted. A majestic energy swept out from her body and shattered the ice. Under normal circumstances, naturally, Han Fenglu wouldn't have been able to deal with the three of them so casually. She would have looked very relaxed. However, the three of them were severely injured and on their last breaths. How could they possibly be her match? It was like a strong tiger defeating three sick and weak tigers of its own kind. Han Fenglu walked toward Bai Jian immediately. This person annoyed her the most. Therefore, killing him first was the safest thing to do. As for Unrivaled God and Luo Rong, it was difficult for them to even move after being injured again. Therefore, there was no need to bother with them. Bai Jian's heart skipped a beat when he saw Unrivaled God walking toward him. You can try to kill him. At this moment, a shout was heard. Han Fenglu looked up and saw Xiaoyang returning with a divine sword in his hand. The sword intent was brilliant. Chapter 1802. Han Fenglu stopped in his tracks when he saw the majestic sword essence. He narrowed his eyes and began to observe the changes in his surroundings. He felt that Xiaoyang would be able to endure until the end, and his judgment of the situation was very accurate. Therefore, since he had the opportunity to escape and was returning so quickly, it was impossible that he was unprepared. Therefore, he had to be more cautious on this point, or he might fall into a trap. However, Han Fenglu did not see any changes, and Xiaoyang seemed to be alone. Could it be that there was an expert lying in ambush? However, thinking about it carefully, Lei Dingtian was severely injured, and it would be a problem for him to protect himself. Moreover, how could he let go of the grudge between him and Xiaoyang so easily? It would be a great thing if he did not kill Xiaoyang, not to mention other things. Therefore, Lei Dingtian could not be a backup plan. Could it be Shan Luo and Jiang Feiyun? However, both of them were only at level 8, and they were still lacking compared to a level 9 expert like him. But soon, Han Fenglu's thoughts turned sharply, and he thought of another possibility. That was, the three of them could join forces to form the three-talent formation. At that time, they could take the incomparably miraculous pill and forcibly raise their cultivation to the 9th order. They might really have a chance. Han Fenglu began to feel anxious when he thought of these possibilities. He knew that if things were as he thought, then he would also be in big trouble. Therefore, he had to be on guard. However, after careful inspection, he could not sense their aura. That was right. Where could he find these helpers in such a short time? In a moment, many thoughts flashed through Han Fenglu's mind, but he could not find an answer. However, he did not dare to let his guard down and continued to look for clues. He knew very well that, sometimes, missing a little detail could be a fatal blow to him. After Xiaoyang arrived, he stood in front of Bai Jian, shielding him behind him. unrivaled god, could not help but frown when he saw that Xiaoyang had returned after leaving. He knew very well that even if he came back now, it would be useless. In fact, he might even lose his life in vain, and he might not even be able to spread the news of this matter. Then it would really become a matter that no one knew about. Although unrivaled god had witnessed the battle between Xiaoyang and the demon lord previously, it had been a fierce and exhilarating battle. It had also been a battle of a higher level. However, if Han Fenglu was only at the beginning of the 9th stage, there was no doubt about it. However, everything was not as he had imagined. Moreover, Han Fenglu had clearly held back during the battle with Venerable Sky Inch, so he only suffered some minor injuries. On the other hand, Xiaoyang had caught the white sword a few times and was later affected by the aftershocks. His injuries were not light either. Xiaoyang shook the divine sword in his hand. A wisp of sword essence swam out and sliced apart the emerald flood dragon. A middle-grade sage level magic weapon was just that sharp. Bai Jian stood up as well. He smiled in satisfaction and said, "How's it going?" "It depends on everyone's luck. It's just a gamble." Xiaoyang smiled calmly. Bai Jian was not worried when he heard that. He felt that under such circumstances, it was necessary to take a gamble in order to protect everyone. As for what the final result would be, it would depend on how lucky they were and whether or not they were lucky. If they were unlucky, they could only die here. Of course, they still had a glimmer of hope, and that was Princess Mingzhu, who was struggling above them and fighting fiercely. Princess Mingzhu hovered high in the sky. Although she had already taken several pills, the speed of her spiritual power recovery was far slower than the speed of her consumption. It could be said that she could not make ends meet. Therefore, this battle was very strenuous for her. She was even being suppressed. It seemed that even defeat was only a matter of time. Although Princess Mingzhu was confident that she was almost invincible in the same realm, her current state was very bad. However, she was in a terrible state right now, and her opponent was Su Muhua, who had reached the 9th stage 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years had passed. Su Muhua's peak 9th level was probably as stable as it could be. If he could stay true to himself, he might be able to break through the realm this time. That was not a joke. It could be said that it was the truth. Su Muhua looked at the fatigued woman in front of her, and the smile on her face became even more intense. Now he felt that this matter was getting more and more interesting. Princess Mingzhu, who was known as the strongest genius in the realm of the gods, was indeed not weak. In fact, she was very domineering. It was a pity that she had experienced too few battles of life and death. Therefore, she seemed a little immature. However, her strength could make up for this. "You're just an arrow at the end of its flight. Why continue to struggle so bitterly? Why don't you give yourself to me? Who knows, you might even get some benefits." As Su Muhua spoke, the smile at the corner of his mouth became wider. When Princess Mingzhu heard this, she did not say a word. What she replied to her opponent was the sharp sword in her hand. When such vulgar words fell into her ears, they were extremely unpleasant to the ears. There was only one way to clear her ears. That was, a dead person could not speak. Therefore, as long as Su Muhua was dead, everything would end. There would not be so much noise. Su Muhua saw countless sword auras coming towards him again and instantly shook his head helplessly. This lady was too arrogant. Moreover, she fought and killed without saying a word. Her temper was a little too impatient. However, this kind of person was more to his liking. Therefore, Su Muhua's eyes shone with excitement. Facing those golden sword auras, Su Muhua did not retreat at all. He punched out, and instantly those sword auras flowed back like seawater. The power of a punch was so terrifying. Han Fenglu searched for a long time, but did not find any trace of it. Now he felt that he might have been overthinking things, and that Xiaoyang's actions were just to mislead others. Thinking of this, Han Fenglu's eyes became much brighter. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for Xiaoyang to find any helpers. Therefore, he was probably setting up a deceptive formation to scare him away. Han Fenglu smiled. These little tricks were indeed interesting. If it wasn't for the fact that the current situation was too clear, he might have really fallen for this trick and become suspicious. Chapter 1803. Good lad, but you've made a mistake. There are only a few people who can stand up for you, but none of them are willing to help you, Han Fenglu said with a grin. Of course, in Han Fenglu's opinion, the only one who could fight him was Lei Dingtian. However, Lei Dingtian wanted nothing more than to grind Xiaoyang's bones to dust. Why would he help him? Therefore, the situation was very clear. Xiaoyang smiled faintly and shrugged, saying, How would you know that I've made a mistake? Moreover, you don't necessarily know what I'm planning. Han Fenglu did not reply. The two of them had talked about luck earlier. What were they betting on? As for what was going on, he couldn't explain it either. However, he was more inclined to believe that Xiaoyang was fooling him and pretending to be calm. Shen Wushuang, on the other hand, frowned slightly. He could not tell what was going on. However, Xiaoyang had always been astute. It was just that his current actions were difficult to guess what he was planning. At this moment, Yang Sun woke up as well. When he saw the hole in his brother's back, his tears fell silently again. He could never have imagined that he would one day be so crazy as to attack his brother. However, he could not control himself. He had no idea what was going on. Now that he thought about it carefully, it seemed that his memory was very blurry. Shen Wushuang seemed to have sensed his brother's abnormality. He turned around and smiled, saying, Xiao Sun, don't blame yourself. You're just being persecuted by a villain. However, Yang Sun did not say anything. He still blamed himself because he felt that if it had been someone else, his brother would not have been so defenseless. Unrivaled God sighed helplessly when he saw that Yang Sun still looked like he was blaming himself. Naturally, he knew his brother's temperament. No matter how much he said, it would not be able to alleviate the guilt in his brother's heart. Therefore, he stopped talking and focused all his attention on Xiaoyang. Xiaoyang thought for a moment and said, I was still a little confused before, but now I am a little clear about your purpose in doing this. Hearing this, Han Fenglu raised his eyebrows slightly and said, Oh, why don't you tell me about it? Han Fenglu was also very curious about how capable Xiaoyang was and whether he could see through her scheme. Actually, it's not difficult. What you're after is probably the thing inside the Heaven's Peak Mountain. If you go in alone, then you won't have a choice. Naturally, your chances of obtaining them will be much greater, Xiaoyang said indifferently. Han Fenglu just smiled. On the surface, this was indeed the case. Then, Xiaoyang continued, However, it's not worth it to take such a big risk for such a small thing. After all, the price to pay is too high. Moreover, it's still unknown whether you can obtain the opportunity in the Heaven's Peak Mountain. Therefore, using this as a fulcrum would be making a mountain out of a molehill. Initially, Han Fenglu thought that Xiaoyang was just SO. However, she was now curious. Shen Wushuang and Bai Jian listened attentively as well. They also wanted to know why Han Fenglu would take such a risk and not be afraid of the God Realm's authority. Since you have the guts to do this, then you must be planning something big. Before I came here, I thought of something. Since you can control me, Yang Sen, Li Chuanyi, and the rest, can you also control Princess Mingzhu? Xiaoyang said with a grin. Hearing this, Han Fenglu's expression changed. However, you're no match for Princess Mingzhu. What can you do? Therefore, you thought of the Heaven's Peak Mountain. When the time comes, everyone will be severely injured while you're at your peak. By then, you'll be able to control the puppets of your loved ones. Won't you be able to do whatever you want? That's why you're in this situation now. Xiaoyang sighed helplessly as he spoke. If he could figure out the crux of the matter earlier, then things wouldn't have evolved to the current situation. Han Fenglu nodded with a smile and said, That's about it. As long as Princess Mingzhu is severely injured, you'll be able to control her. After leaving the tomb of the God of Sin, I'm afraid your marriage will be arranged. Everyone knows that Princess Mingzhu is very likely to be the next empress. When that happens, the Empress will be your puppet. Won't the god realm be controlled by you? Xiaoyang said casually. Han Fenglu's expression changed when she heard this. Their real goal was indeed to control the god realm, and Princess Mingzhu, the god's favored one, was the opportunity. Immediately, Han Fenglu laughed and clapped her hands. Your analysis is brilliant. It's simple and crude. You hit the nail on the head. It's a pity that you're not my friend. Otherwise, it would be much easier to carry out this plan. Han Fenglu did feel that it was a pity. If she had Xiaoyang's help, everything would be stable and there would not be any accidents. So far, the biggest accident was Xiaoyang. He killed 3 of his junior brothers in one go, causing him to be unable to control the others. This was his biggest miscalculation. If it wasn't for him suddenly killing people, the situation would have been settled long ago. As for the one in the sky, I'm afraid she's not part of your plan. It's an unexpected surprise, the icing on the cake. Xiaoyang said with a smile. Han Fenglu didn't deny it and nodded, openly admitting it. This matter was only the result of repeated discussions and deliberations with the sect a few years ago after he obtained the secret technique. They could control the god realm at the smallest cost. Although it would take a long time, it did not matter. Especially to Han Fenglu, he was still very young. He could wait. If he were to become the prince consort of the god realm and perform well, he might even be able to become the ruler of the god realm on the surface. Of course, there was a prerequisite. Princess Mingzhu had to listen to him. Who would have thought that Xiaoyang would be able to see through the plan that he had been planning for a few years after revealing some flaws? Next to her, unrivaled god's mouth twitched subconsciously when he learned of this result. This seemingly gentle and elegant young man dressed in a green robe, who treated others with gentleness, actually had such wild ambitions under his skin. How despicable! Chapter 1804. Therefore, the Greenlee world had kept a low profile in the beginning because they had a plan in mind. Now that everything was about to be done, their wild ambitions were completely exposed. It could be said that such an appetite was very big. If they could control the god world, they would be the #1 person in the 3,000 small worlds. When that happened, they would have an inexhaustible supply of resources. But what can you do even if you know all this? It's a good thing you met Uncle Master Su. Even if there's an accident like you, it won't change the situation, Han Fenglu said with a cold smile. At the same time, Han Fenglu began to make up her mind. She knew very well that Xiaoyang could not be allowed to live. If such an intelligent person were to be allowed to live on and his deeds were to be exposed, the Greenlee world would most likely be in deep trouble. Especially his sect and clan, they would definitely be annihilated. Back then, the Thousand Thunder Palace had only provoked some small worlds. Later on, they were suppressed and forced to commit suicide as an apology. When that happened, if the god world was angry, they would not just find a random scapegoat to resolve the matter. Xiaoyang smiled faintly and did not continue speaking. However, he could clearly feel the killing intent in Lin Fan's eyes. But you're still a little stupid. Sometimes being too smart isn't necessarily a good thing, Han Fenglu said in a low voice. If Xiaoyang had not explained the matter clearly, Han Fenglu naturally would not have such a murderous intent. However, Xiaoyang shrugged nonchalantly and said, I just want to verify if my thoughts are correct. Besides, whether you can take me down is still a question. Moreover, even if I really want to leave, I'm afraid you can't stop me. Since Xiaoyang dared to come back, he naturally had the confidence to leave. As for why he came back, the reason was very simple. It was because Shen Wushuang, his close friend, was here, and Bai Jian, his sworn friend, was here too. Therefore, he definitely could not leave Shen Wushuang to die. Even if there was a slight chance, he had to give it a try. Who knew, with his efforts, he might be able to turn this hopeless situation around. He might even be able to save their lives. There were many things that could only be known after trying. If you were unwilling to do it, you would definitely not succeed. Now that you mention it, I really need to be careful. Thank you for your kind reminder, Han Fenglu said coldly. The jade-green bamboo, cane in his hand, began to emit a dim light once again. It looked extremely strange. Suddenly, Xiaoyang felt some changes in the aura around him. Immediately, he frowned slightly. He also felt that something was amiss. Soon, several auras surged and gathered together. Raising his head, Xiaoyang also saw some dead souls rushing over. Immediately, Xiaoyang remembered that he had sensed some dead spirits following him. There were quite a few of them, and they had kept a good distance. If he had not been paying attention, he would not have noticed them at all. Xiaoyang knew that something was wrong. Previously, someone had controlled the dead spirits to attack Lu Qianshan. It must have been their doing. He did not know if Song Zhongling had controlled the dead spirits himself or if it was Mo Yuan. However, there was one thing he was sure of. That was a self-directed act. It was to bait Xiaoyang. Bai Jian understood Xiaoyang's intention with just one look. He immediately unleashed the spiritual energy that he had recovered while speaking and charged out quickly. Xiaoyang began to move quickly as well. He arrived next to Xin Wushuang in a flash. Han Fenglu, on the other hand, was not in a hurry at all. She only stared at Xiaoyang. She wanted to see what kind of trouble this guy could stir up. Moreover, the reason why Han Fenglu didn't make a move now was so that he could defeat Xiaoyang more easily later on. Xiaoyang glanced at Xin Jinyi in the distance and sighed. He immediately grabbed Xin Wushuang and Xin Jinyi and charged in that direction. Bai Jian saw this and immediately grabbed Luo Rong and Luo Ku as well. They headed in the direction Xiaoyang had gone. Han Fenglu watched calmly. Soon she frowned and smiled. The two of them were really stupid. They could not even protect themselves now, but they still wanted to protect others. What wishful thinking! How could they care about others' safety when they crossed the river? After the two of them met, they stood still and observed their surroundings. Xiaoyang shouted. The thunder, fire divine, sword in his hand, started to move. Suddenly, lightning and fire fell down. It was like a barrier that could not be moved. Spear! Xiaoyang said anxiously. Shen Wushuang immediately returned the silver thunder fire spear and said somewhat anxiously, It's best if you leave now. Xiaoyang did not seem to hear him. He immediately walked out and stood with his spear. As long as you don't leave this barrier, those undead can't do anything to you. Take the time to recover. I'm not sure how long I can last, Xiaoyang said coldly. Hearing this, Shen Wushuang frowned slightly. He seemed to be in pain. However, they knew very well that how could they recover in such a short time? Their current abilities were less than 30% of what they had been before. Although Shen Wushuang understood what Xiaoyang meant, he could not bear to do it. Could it be that he could only watch Xiaoyang fight alone like a cripple? Soon, Xiaoyang moved and arrived beside Li Chuanyi. He lifted him up. At that moment, the undead had arrived. They were like demons and ghosts, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. Upon closer inspection, there were as many as 7 of them. Each of them was at least on par with King Wu's rank 8 abilities. Some of them even had rank 9 abilities. It was terrifying. Initially, Xiaoyang and Bai Jian had worked together to kill the 3 from the green Li world to turn the tables. However, from the looks of it now, their previous efforts seemed rather insignificant. Immediately, Xiaoyang carried Li Chuanyi to the divine sword and tossed him in. At the same time, he took out a few medicine bottles and tossed them in. He said, The green medicine bottles contain the antidote. Once they've taken it, just crush the imprint in their divine consciousness. Although Gu Shen and Mo Yuan, who were controlling Yang Sun and the others, were dead, there was no guarantee that Han Fenglu would not be able to do the same. Therefore, if something went wrong in the end, it would not be optimistic. Therefore, Xiaoyang could only fight with all his might without worrying about the situation behind him after he had resolved all his worries. Chapter 1805. Bai Jian was stunned. He did not expect Xiaoyang to concoct the antidote so quickly. It was a little too fast. However, when did he do it? Bai Jian could not figure this out. However, he was certain that since Xiao Yang was able to take out this item, it would naturally be effective. Han Fenglu frowned slightly when he saw this from afar. The way he looked at the champion of the grand competition changed again. This was something he had not expected. However, he was sure that Xiao Yang was not simple. The antidote was naturally not refined in the divine tomb. It was prepared outside, and the medicinal properties just happened to be helpful. This person's preparation was so thorough that it really made people feel a little apprehensive. How many more tricks did he have up his sleeves? This was something to ponder. Perhaps he looked like he was at the end of his rope, but he still had a huge killer move prepared. The more he thought about it, the more shocked Han Fenglu was. If that was the case, he had to be careful. If something went wrong, would he not have to pay a huge price? What Han Fenglu did not know was that the antidote was indeed refined in the divine tomb. However, he did not open the furnace to refine the pill. It was condensed from his poison power, and he used the method of fighting poison with poison. Therefore, he needed someone to watch over it so that no accidents would happen. Xiao Yang waved the silver spear in his hand, and lightning surged as if there were countless flames of anger that wanted to be vented. It was very strong and unstoppable. Are you angry? I'd like to see how capable the champion of this grand competition is, Han Fenglu said, and placed the jade bamboo cane in front of him. From his point of view, not only was Xiao Yang severely injured, he was also at a disadvantage in terms of cultivation base. Moreover, the Thunderfire Divine Sword, which was of the highest grade, had to protect the group of useless people behind him. How could he compete with them? Xiao Yang grinned and said, "You can give it a try." After he finished speaking, Xiao Yang leaped up. Instantly, like a bolt of lightning, he dashed forward. His target was Han Fenglu. How could he be careless when facing a 9th-stage powerhouse? Moreover, Xiao Yang had already fought with Lei Dingtian, who was at the 9th Order Advanced Stage, and under his careful planning they had fought to a draw. No one had gained any advantage, and they could only escape with heavy injuries. This was what it meant to move like a thunderbolt. It needed to be fast, accurate, and ruthless. Han Fenglu frowned slightly when she saw the incomparably ferocious lightning glow. This kind of powerful lightning energy did not seem to be inferior to that person. Han Fenglu even had the illusion that he was facing Lei Dingtian, who was at the same level as him. She was incomparably valiant and did not care about the consequences or gains. At the same time, Han Fenglu immediately waved her jade bamboo staff. Suddenly, faint light spots expanded rapidly and turned into a dragon that flew over. This was also the best move of the current #1 genius of the Greenlee world. Using the dragon to wrap around the opponent could not resist at all. Han Fenglu had almost never missed this move, except for Honorable Lord Inch Sky, who had absolute strength to break free from it. Most of the time, Han Fenglu only needed to use this move in a battle, and the outcome was already decided. Moreover, the opponent's level was not just a little bit lower than his. Therefore, he was not worried at all. However, Xiao Yang's valiance was not as simple as Han Fenglu thought. With a loud shout, thunder exploded from the tip of the spear. Suddenly, it was like the power of heaven inviolable. It swept across and directly cut the jade dragon in half. It could be said that it was very decisive and did not have the slightest hesitation. When Han Fenglu saw this, he couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. This was truly beyond his expectations. Was this guy's strength already so strong? He could even break his famous consummate skill so easily? However, what Han Fenglu did not know was that Xiao Yang's spiritual power level was already at the peak of King Wu's level 8. Of course, Xiao Yang's confidence came from using Lei Dingtian's electric net thunder prison to successfully temper his body and reach level 9. It was also because of this, and in addition to his pride, that when Honorable Lord Inch Sky chose to self-destruct in the end, the injuries he suffered were much lighter than others. At least, it was not as serious as Han Fenglu had predicted. Han Fenglu almost couldn't believe her eyes. Was what she was seeing really real? At this moment, he was also very surprised. Xiao Yang's attack did not stop because of this. Instead, it went straight ahead. Wherever the tip of the spear passed, it could be said that there was one explosion after another. As long as there was a trace of death in the surroundings, it would be completely destroyed and no longer exist. If he could use this method to take down Han Fenglu, it would naturally be a good thing. However, as the #1 genius of the Greenly world, Han Fenglu had naturally experienced many battles. Therefore, he naturally knew in his heart how dangerous the situation was at this moment. Soon after, he waved the jade bamboo cane in his hand once again. However, this time he was not as relaxed as before. Instead, he waved it extremely quickly. The spots of dim light were like seeds. They fell on the ground and added a bit of greenery. In the next moment, the dim light seemed to have taken root. Countless jade bamboos were quickly uprooted from the ground. However, every bamboo looked like a sharp sword that shot into the sky. After Xiao Yang sensed the bamboo forest that was uprooted like a sharp sword, he was slightly stunned. However, he did not retreat at all and continued to charge forward. Seeing that Xiao Yang was still ferociously charging towards him, Han Fenglu's lips curled into a disdainful smile. At the same time, he revealed a look of satisfaction that his plan had succeeded. It was as if everything was within his calculations. Although Xiao Yang was brave and his strength was extraordinary, at times he still knew too little. The jade bamboos quickly changed. They started to become like vines. They began to intertwine and weave as if they were weaving a large net. More of them were like the stinger of a poisonous scorpion. They shot towards Xiao Yang to kill him. After he was wrapped up, Xiao Yang immediately felt that the qi in his body seemed to be affected. Moreover, it was extremely uncomfortable. It was even difficult for him to resist. Every jade bamboo was filled with murderous intent. When they came towards him, he had no choice but to take a few steps back and stop attacking. Chapter 1806. Seeing that Xiao Yang was trapped in that strange bamboo forest, Bai Jian's brows knitted together again. He had only heard of such a strange technique, but he did not know much about it. He did not have much interaction with the Greenly world, so he only heard of it but did not know much about it. However, from the very beginning, Bai Jian felt that Xiao Yang could create miracles. However, he knew very well that the gap between their realms was not something that could be easily overcome. Moreover, the current battle situation was extremely disadvantageous to them, no matter how one looked at it. Shen Wushuang shook his head helplessly and said, "This is the jade bamboo formation, a technique that Han Fenglu used years ago. It's very powerful. I heard that the bamboo forest is a formation that can restrict the cultivation of the cultivators inside. It's very miraculous." Shen Wushuang felt a little helpless when he said that. He did not expect Han Fenglu to not be arrogant at all. She had used her gatekeeping skills to target them so quickly. Although this was the greatest respect she could give to Xiao Yang, it also destroyed the last glimmer of hope in their hearts. Xiao Yang was already at a disadvantage to begin with. If the other party had the chance to relax, they might have been able to succeed. However, Han Fenglu wasn't an arrogant person. On the contrary, everything was carried out in an orderly manner. It was truly terrifying. Bai Jian's heart sank when he heard that. Although he was in the best condition here, he could not help because he was not strong enough. He felt very aggrieved that he could not do anything. This kind of injury was not important to someone like Bai Jian. However, he could not even condense a single strand of sword qi. How could he fight? The more he thought about it, the more upset Bai Jian felt. Could it be that he could only watch Xiao Yang fight alone like he did in the Thousand Thunder secret realm while he waited patiently? In the blink of an eye, Bai Jian snorted coldly and took out a few bottles of pills. He consumed them all and began to convert them into spiritual power. No matter what, he had to recover quickly so that he could share some of Xiao Yang's burden. Seeing Bai Jian's actions, Shen Wushuang knew what was going on. He began to treat Shinjinyi as well. If he could wake them up and cast a 5 elements formation to restrict Han Fenglu, the situation would be much better. Since his condition did not allow him to fight head-on, he might as well do something within his power. If he just watched and placed all his hopes on Xiaoyang without trying to save himself, he would be digging his own grave. If he did not save himself despite knowing the situation, he would be hopeless. The 7 dead spirits circling in the sky wanted to touch these weak cultivators, but they were afraid of the divine sword hanging high in the sky, so they didn't dare to touch them in the slightest. Obviously, they were very wary of it. The thunder and fire elements were the best at restraining them. Moreover, it was a mid-grade sage-level Dharma weapon. Its power was unquestionable. Therefore, although they were tempted, they did not dare to offend it. Han Fenglu smiled disdainfully when she saw that her formation had trapped Xiaoyang. Her gaze then fell on Bai Jian and the others. Especially when he saw Bai Jian begin to accumulate power, his brows furrowed unconsciously. Han Fenglu had long heard of this jade-faced, white sword who was showing off his abilities. She had never seen how fast his sword was with her own eyes. Previously, when he fought against Venerable Sky Inch, there were some specific factors. Therefore, she could not see it clearly. However, she knew very well that if these people really had a chance to catch their breath, it might not be a good thing. There might even be unexpected twists and turns because of this. Therefore, she had to be careful when dealing with them. Therefore, how to react next was an important matter. What are you looking at? Go. Han Fenglu reprimanded angrily. When the dead spirits heard their master's reprimand, they immediately began to stir. However, they were still hesitant. It was as if they were darkness and could not see the light, while the thunder and fire divine sword was the scorching sun. It made them feel dazzled and did not dare to approach it at all. After seeing this scene, Han Fenglu also gritted her teeth and was very angry. She did not expect Xiaoyang's previous actions to be so powerful. He was actually able to deter these dead spirits and make them not dare to invade. However, she also gave a death order. Immediately, a few dead spirits with high cultivations also began to move. They drove the black fog to rush towards the divine sword. Immediately, lightning and fire rose one after another. As long as the black fog invaded even a little, it would be completely destroyed. At the same time, the divine sword seemed to be enraged. Countless strands of sword chi surged out and swept out in all directions mercilessly. After some of the dead spirits were hit, their bodies began to tremble. The fear in their hearts grew even more intense. Unrivaled God could not help but feel a little anxious when he saw the dead spirits beginning to attack. However, he could not stop his pace of saving people. At the same time, he also believed that this mid-grade sage magic weapon could protect them. At least for a while they would be safe. In such a desperate situation, they were at the end of their rope. However, there was still a lot of unwillingness in his heart. No matter what, he had to persevere. Those dead spirits did not seem to be afraid of death at all. They charged wildly, allowing the black fog around them to begin to diminish. At the same time, the thunder and fire divine sword was also beginning to shake a little. It was as if under the joint attack of these 7 dead spirits, it could not hold up on its own. Although it was restrained by attributes, the dead spirits were afraid from the beginning. However, if one party's strength surpassed it and was not afraid, then it was not impossible to break through. On the side, Han Fenglu felt even more resentful when she saw how slow the progress was. This Xiaoyang was really meticulous. Even though he was trapped, he was still able to ensure the safety of his companions. That was really impressive. That thing restrains the dead spirits, but it doesn't have the same effect on me. Han Fenglu said somewhat angrily. Then, she strode forward, preparing to take the divine sword herself. If she attacked forcefully, these dead spirits would be greatly exhausted. These were things that she needed to deal with future changes. She had to cherish them. Suddenly, Han Fenglu stopped in her tracks and looked towards the bamboo forest. Chapter 1807. High up in the sky, the woman, who looked incomparably pure, was already covered in blood from the start of the battle. Her essence, energy, and spirit looked much more dispirited. Compared to Princess Mingzhu, she was worlds apart. Previously, she had been so high-spirited and exuded an aura of supremacy, which made countless people revere her. In fact, his imposing manner even caused many people to be intoxicated by him. However, at this moment, she no longer had the same imposing manner as before. She only had an indescribable grievance. If it was before the battle with supremacy in sky, she would not be afraid even if she faced a powerful genius from 1,000 years ago. In fact, she could even compete with him. Even if she could not defeat him, she would not be like now, where she could only barely defend herself. Sometimes, she even had to suffer a little more. The more Su Muhua fought, the more shocked she was. She felt that Princess Mingzhu was indeed worthy of being called the #1 genius in the realm of the gods. Her strength and nature were indeed extraordinary. She was already an arrow at the end of its flight, but she had been entangled with her for so long. Could it be that the younger generation would surpass the older? After thinking about this, the smile on Su Muhua's face became a little strange. If she could conquer such a woman and become dual cultivation companions, it might be a wonderful thing. As for whether the woman agreed or not, it was not up to her. Princess Mingzhu stood with her sword and breathed heavily. Now, she did not have much energy left in her body, and she was even holding on with her magic weapon and her last breath. However, it was hard to say what the outcome would be if she continued to fight like this. Therefore, she was also yearning for someone to appear and break the stalemate. If she wanted to leave, she could have done so earlier. However, at this moment, she was afraid that she could not escape anymore. Therefore, the only choice before her was to fight to the death. Only then, she might have a chance of survival. Fortunately, there was another person fighting hard below. This made her feel that she was not fighting alone, and she was somewhat gratified. However, the person that her cousin mentioned made Princess Mingzhu think highly of him again. Under such circumstances, he didn't leave, so how could he leave? Even if she already knew the result, she would not leave so easily. However, it was still difficult for Princess Mingzhu to figure out how to break this deadlock. She really didn't know what to do about this matter. However, she firmly believed that as long as she did not give up, there might still be some hope. If he fled like this, even if he managed to save his own life, what about the others? Su Muhua smiled sinisterly and said, "I think you should give up on struggling. Why don't you serve me well and make me happy so that they can live?" With that said, Su Muhua also pointed below. Her intention was also very clear. Princess Mingzhu still did not reply. Instead, she placed the sharp sword in front of her chest and raised it. The sharp sword once again shone with a golden light. She had nothing to say to this kind of person, and she didn't have the extra energy to speak. Therefore, her answer was the sword in her hand. Su Muhua shook her head playfully when she saw the aloof princess who refused to listen to anything she said. It seemed that he could only beat him until he was obedient with his punches. However, this kind of subjugation seemed to be pretty good too. Instantly, the battle that had paused for a while started again. The golden light was dazzling, and the sword aura was everywhere. Black gas filled the air, and the fist wind blew. Han Fenglu stopped and looked at the bamboo forest with a slight frown on his face. He originally thought that after using this move, he would be able to surround and kill Xiaoyang, who was at the end of his rope. He didn't expect this chief to be so extraordinary. He actually wanted to carve out a path of blood. This made him feel a little strange. However, what great ability did he have to overturn the heavens? Thinking of the variable that was Xiaoyang, Han Fenglu did not dare to take the thunder, fire, divine sword first. He could only kill it first. Xiaoyang was in the bamboo forest, using the silver spear in his hand to destroy the jade bamboos that were attacking him. However, the speed at which the jade bamboos grew was extremely fast. The space left for Xiaoyang to move was already very small. This could be said to be filled with strangeness, and Xiaoyang did not dare to be the slightest bit careless. In addition, he was worried about the outside world, so he couldn't help but feel a little anxious. The Thunder Fire Divine sword could only slightly stop the undead's attack rhythm, but it couldn't do it forever. Move like thunder. Xiaoyang let out a low roar and immediately used the Thunder Sword technique from the Thunder Fire Sword technique on the Silver Spear. Although the weapons were vastly different, Xiaoyang had already cultivated this technique to the extreme. He was able to wield it with ease and was not restricted to the spear and the sword at all. With this move, countless bolts of lightning exploded. At the same time, Xiaoyang also charged forward, not caring about other problems at all. As long as he could kill his way out, that would be enough. As for other things, they would be discussed in the future. Countless jade bamboos were constantly shattered under this tyrannical force, as if they were unstoppable. There were also countless jade bamboos that stabbed at the completely exposed back like sharp swords. Some were directly shattered by the lightning, and some were unable to break through the will of the net. In an instant, Xiaoyang blasted a hole in the bamboo forest and killed his way out. Han Fenglu looked at the other side. The young man was covered in lightning, like a thunderball, and his power was unparalleled. At this moment, Han Fenglu was really a little flustered. It seemed that that person was Lei Dingtian. Soon, Han Fenglu also remembered what Gu Shun had told him before. Lei Dingtian fought with someone, and in the end he was seriously injured. Originally, he wanted to take advantage of the situation and control this insufferably arrogant genius. But unfortunately he failed. If Gu Shun could successfully control Lei Dingtian, who was in the upper 9th level, then the battle here would have been settled. Han Fenglu had always been curious about who had fought with Lei Dingtian. He had done a lot of analysis and felt that it was very unreliable. The only person who could have fought with Lei Dingtian was Bai Jian. However, if Bai Jian could succeed, then Lei Dingtian would not be alive. Now, Han Fenglu had another guess. That was Xiaoyang. Xiaoyang and Lei Dingtian originally had a blood feud between them, so it seemed reasonable for them to fight. Chapter 1808. Impossible. Han Fenglu shook his head and quickly denied his own thoughts. To him, no matter how weak Lei Dingtian was, he was at least in the 9th level. He was also the strongest existence among the three of them. Xiaoyang may be the leader, but in terms of cultivation level, his disadvantage was too great. How could he be Lei Dingtian's opponent? Such an idea was simply wishful thinking. However, Han Fenglu had also returned to the starting point. Then who was it that made Lei Dingtian so severely injured? Then, Han Fenglu swept away all these thoughts. It didn't seem to make much sense to investigate and calculate these things now. Right now, defeating Xiaoyang would be the most important thing for him to do. Everything else could be put aside for now. There was no need to think about it. Han Fenglu held the jade bamboo cane and stared deadly at the leader. He sneered. "Looks like I underestimated you. I didn't think you would be able to walk out." However, Xiaoyang looked very calm. It was as if he didn't care at all. Naturally, Xiaoyang had already experienced the dangers involved in this matter before. However, he managed to get out. To be able to turn danger into safety was his ability. However, because of this, he had to be careful. Han Fenglu really hid her abilities well. It was impossible to guard against her. Sometimes, the attack from above would be useless in the end. It might even put oneself in danger. It could be said that people like her, who appeared to be gentle to others, but who knew how many tricks she had up her sleeve, were the scariest, because you would never know whether or not you would fall into a sure-kill trap and sink deep into a quagmire. I am very curious. Why do you think your plan is flawless? Why do you think it will succeed? Xiaoyang said coldly. Han Fenglu shrugged and said, "It's just a matter of effort. Besides, The realm of gods having you, Xiaoyang, was outside of my expectations. But at the same time, Junior Su was also outside of your expectations. So, it seems that I've earned more out of these two accidents. The truth was indeed so. Their strongest princess Mingzhu, under the suppression of Sumu Hua, was almost unable to breathe. If there was only Han Fenglu now, it would not be too difficult for them to join forces to deal with her. However, with the addition of Sumu Hua, the situation had completely changed, making it impossible for them to resist. Seeing Xiao Yang's ashen face, the smile on Han Fenglu's face grew even wider. Because, in his opinion, if you don't gamble big, how can you make a lot of money? Since this opportunity had fallen into his hands, if he didn't cherish it, he would really be insensible. Very quickly, Han Fenglu's face turned cold, and the jade bamboo cane in her hand directly swung down. Suddenly, a huge shadow of a bamboo cane fell down, and severe warning. When Xiaoyang saw the big stick falling down, he snorted coldly and rushed up to the sky. With the help of lightning, he directly smashed the jade bamboo cane into pieces. In an instant, Han Fenglu's face turned ugly. The bamboo cane in her hand was a lower sacred weapon, and its power was naturally not bad. She didn't expect that the kid would smash it into pieces. This was really unexpected. After waking up, Luo Rong forced himself to sit up. He looked at the undead spirits around him, and his face changed drastically. Then, a wave of coldness attacked him, and a piece of mysterious ice appeared in his hand. But because of this, he spat out a mouthful of blood, and his body went limp and he fell to the ground. The mysterious ice also fell to the ground with a clang. Luo Rong looked at the mysterious ice that had only condensed into a sword hilt, and his heart was filled with regret. If he could condense a mysterious ice sword, he might be able to turn the situation around. However, after feeling a hint of warmth, he noticed the changes around him. The alternating red and white light screen had a hint of warmth, and it isolated all the undead spirits outside. Don't worry, Brother Luo. Take the time to recover your strength. When we set up the formation later, you'll be able to help a little, Unrivaled God said calmly. Luo Rong nodded slightly, but when he saw Luo Ku lying next to him, he frowned again, and his expression was very complicated. You don't have to worry about that. Xiao Yang gave me the antidote, and I also helped to remove the imprint in Luo Ku's divine consciousness. He won't be controlled anymore, Unrivaled God added when he saw this. Luo Rong nodded slightly at Unrivaled God to express his gratitude. At the same time, he looked at the chief, and the look in his eyes became even more complicated. There was even more admiration in them. When he found out that his brother had lost to him, Luo Rong was still a little unconvinced. However, from the looks of it now, this chief really deserved the title. Xiao Yang used the power of the silver spear in his hand to attack directly. For a moment, thunderbolts bombarded Luo Rong continuously. Now he had no worries in his heart. Every time he attacked, it was a swift and fierce killing move. Perhaps it was because of his pride that he did not know the difference between them at all. All he knew was to attack with his spear. So what if you're more powerful than me? However, that doesn't stop me from attacking you. Luo Rong saw the situation turn around and quickly retreated. His fearless stance was indeed frightening. Moreover, the jade bamboo staff in his hand was not suitable for close combat. Therefore, no matter how one looked at it, it did not seem appropriate to fight force with force now. At the same time, a few undead spirits immediately flew over and surrounded Xiaoyang. Right now, the biggest threat seemed to be this chief of the grand competition. As long as he was killed, everything would be fine. On top of a hill, there was a hammer with very strange patterns carved on it. In particular, the thunderbolt carved on it was even more terrifying. It was as if it was a mark left behind by God. One could not look directly at it. Next to the hammer, there was a letter and a bottle of pills. Although there was an undead spirit circling the area, it seemed to be very afraid of the hammer and did not dare to go closer to investigate. All of a sudden, The undead spirit seemed to have sensed something and fled in a hurry. A tall man with a robe embroidered with thunderbolts flew over with the wind. He headed straight for the barren mountain, looking very anxious. At the same time, there was anger between the man's brows. However, he could not vent it at the moment and felt very uncomfortable. However, his eyes were very listless and he looked very tired. It was as if he had experienced too many accidents, and that was why he looked so tired. Chapter 1809. The tired young man walked to the top of the mountain and looked at the hammer. His eyes immediately emitted a fiery glow. His body seemed to be trembling because of his excitement. It was as if everything in front of him had become unreal. The hammer seemed to have sensed its owner's aura and released streaks of lightning on its own accord. They lingered around the hammer and looked extremely gorgeous. Every streak of lightning seemed to be telling him of his yearning for the past few years. He staggered over and held the hammer in his hand. Immediately, the lightning became even stronger, and a divine aura appeared spontaneously. When the spirits of death within 100 miles sensed it, they subconsciously prostrated themselves on the ground and trembled as if a great disaster was about to befall them. Streaks of lightning surged out like a child who had been locked up for a long time and was venting his emotions to his heart's content. It was difficult for him to control himself. After a long while, the smile on the young man's face grew wider. However, a trace of doubt flashed across his mind. Something was obviously wrong with this item appearing here. He lowered his head and saw a bottle of pills. Underneath the pills was a letter. The young man glanced at the hammer surrounded by lightning in his hand, and then at the bottle and letter on the ground. His frown deepened. Then the young man stroked the hammer and said, "It seems that he wants to use you to make a deal with me. I want to know what kind of deal he wants to make." This hammer was the sacred lightning hammer. The young man was Lei Dingtian of the Thousand Thunder Realm. It was also because of this that they were so close to each other. It could be said that Lei Dingtian had come here because he had sensed the sacred lightning hammer's aura. That was why he had come here regardless of his own safety. This was a keepsake passed down from generation to generation in the Thousand Thunder Palace. Since he had sensed its aura, how could he not come for it? It could be said that before this, Lei Dingtian had thought of many ways to find the sacred lightning hammer's whereabouts in hopes of finding it. However, in the end he had found nothing. He didn't know if it was lost in the Thousand Thunder secret realm or in Xiaoyang's hands. Since then, there had been no news of the sacred lightning hammer. Only now, when he held it in his hand, could he be sure. All this time, Xiaoyang had not used the holy thunder hammer since he obtained it. He had always left it in the warehouse, gathering dust. That was why Lei Dingtian could not sense it. This was also the reason why Xiaoyang suddenly left. He was gambling. They were betting on whether Lei Dingtian would join forces with them after obtaining the holy lightning hammer and temporarily put aside their grudges. One could say that this was a huge gamble. If he made the right bet, then he would have a chance of survival. If he lost, then he would be consigned to eternal damnation. Lei Dingtian stretched out his hand and took the pill. He then put it aside. He was quite curious about what kind of deal he had with Yi Futian in the letter. Xiaoyang looked at the undead floating in the sky. His hand holding the gun tightened. At the same time, several possibilities appeared in his mind. How should he fight next? As for how long he could last, these were the biggest questions. In such a desperate situation, sometimes it was necessary to be careful. Moreover, he did not know if his reinforcements would come. Of course, it was not that Xiaoyang did not have any other tricks up his sleeve, but he needed time. Although he could use his flexibility to hold on, he did not know if the others could. In the next moment, the three undead displayed their own abilities and began to attack Xiaoyang. Suddenly, 3 clouds of black fog rushed over. It was like a tide, surging violently and full of power. Xiaoyang bellowed, and the silver spear in his hand quickly shot out. Immediately, streaks of lightning continuously poured out and collided with the black fog. For a moment, the sound of explosions could be heard. Although there was a lot of hidden power hidden in the black fog, it seemed a little weak in front of the power of its own attribute. At the same time, Xiaoyang also quickly began to move his body and began to widen the distance. At the same time, he also killed one of the undead at an extremely fast speed. In Han Fenglu's hands, there were a total of 7 undead. So if he could kill one, there would naturally be one less. Han Fenglu's eyes darted around, and he also began to quickly analyze the situation. In his opinion, Xiaoyang was indeed a great threat, and it was not worth it to fight him head-on. Therefore, the most important thing was to first use these undead to exhaust his strength. When he was at the end of his life, wouldn't it be easy to deal with him? With this thought in mind, Han Fenglu urged the other undead to attack Xiaoyang together. Immediately, the other undead also turned their spears around at an extremely fast speed, no longer doing that useless thing. With the protection of the Thunder Fire Divine Sword, although the undead had begun to attack, they were very afraid and did not dare to use their full strength. However, it was still very good to use it to deal with Xiaoyang and wear down his strength. At the same time, Han Fenglu's gaze also fell on the Thunder Fire Divine Sword. If he could suppress that sword, then Xiaoyang might be in a mess. Previously, Xiaoyang had made all his preparations so that he could fight without any scruples. However, if he had any misgivings, then he would naturally be restricted. In the next moment, Han Fenglu held onto the jade bamboo cane and directly pounced towards the divine sword. Immediately, Xiaoyang saw that Han Fenglu was thinking about the Thunder Fire Divine Sword and naturally knew his intentions. Immediately after, he shook the silver spear in his hand and charged forward, ignoring the undead spirits around him that were attacking him. He was like a bolt of lightning, tearing through the sky as he charged forward. That aura was even more unparalleled. After feeling that anger, he immediately felt a sense of fear and wanted nothing more than to quickly retreat. However, they could not retreat. The order they had received was to entangle the person holding the spear with one finger and even kill him at all costs. One by one, the undead spirits used their own bodies to block him. After the silver spear pierced through the chest of an undead spirit, it continued to charge forward. Very quickly, a second undead spirit blocked behind him, causing Xiaoyang to be unable to advance any further. In the blink of an eye, the lightning on the silver spear exploded, and the dead spirit that had been pierced was instantly killed. At the same time, he quickly shot out a second spear. Since he was going to fight, he naturally had to fight to his heart's content. If he could kill one more, it would be one more. Under the Thunder Fire Divine Sword, Luo Rong stood up, and with a low shout, he threw out the condensed sword hilt. His target was Han Fenglu. Right now, he could only save himself. Chapter 1810. Although Luo Rong was displeased with Xiaoyang because of what he had heard previously, he was still aware of the current situation. If he did not make a move, they would definitely be besieged once the Thunder Fire Divine Sword above their heads fell. By then, Xiaoyang would be entangled by the undead spirits and would not be able to rescue them in time. They would only be killed by then. After the shard was sent out, it turned into countless shards and flew toward Han Fenglu rapidly. Each attack contained an extremely powerful force. It was as if they were invincible and difficult to defend against. However, Han Fenglu merely glanced at it indifferently. Soon after, he let out a cold snort. The bamboo cane in his hand once again emitted a dim light. It swiftly swelled and collided with the mysterious ice fragments. In an instant, the green shards froze and fell to the ground one after another. At the same time, Han Fenglu immediately changed her direction and prepared to continue attacking from another direction. Luo Rong immediately raised his qi when he saw this. However, he only managed to raise it halfway before it fell rapidly. He wanted to fight back, but he was severely injured and had little spiritual power left. There was no way he could fight back at all. He felt rather miserable. The current him could be said to be at a loss of what to do. Shen Wushuang, on the other hand, let out a low roar. His entire body glowed with a golden light, and his aura suddenly increased significantly at this moment. In the next moment, a long spear appeared in Shan Wushuang's hands. He threw it out with all his might. Han Fenglu's expression changed slightly when she saw the long spear coming toward her. She did not expect these fellows to still be able to put up a desperate fight when they were already at the end of their rope. Indeed, he had underestimated their capabilities. However, such a last-ditch struggle was meaningless in Han Fenglu's eyes. Everything was already set in stone. No one could change it. She was very clear about this, and was very sure of it. The bamboo cane was waved once again, and threads of light once again blossomed at this moment. It was extremely dazzling. Now that Han Fenglu had made her move, she wanted to crush the confidence of these powerless people. He wanted them to know that no matter how much effort they put in, it was impossible to change the overall situation. What awaited them was still death, and this was something that no one could change. Thinking of this, Han Fenglu's expression became much more excited. Immediately, the bamboo cane fell, and the long spear fell to the ground as if it had suffered a heavy blow. For a time, it could be said that smoke and dust rose in all directions, and the earth shook and the mountains shook. It could be seen how terrifying the power of this attack was. However, it could not hurt Han Fenglu at all. The disparity in strength was already difficult to overcome. In addition, everyone was already an arrow at the end of its flight. It was naturally very strenuous for them to deal with the nearly powerful Han Fenglu. In fact, it could even be said that they were nothing more than empty shells now. In fact, it could even be said that they could not withstand a single blow. Sometimes, reality made one feel helpless. The situation was like this, and it was difficult to change. Luo Rong's expression became very ugly. What should he do now? For a time, he could not come up with a satisfactory answer in his heart. He was extremely vexed. However, Luo Rong was, after all, a person who had reached the upper tier of the 9th level, and he had experienced many battles. Immediately, he calmed himself down. At the same time, his eyes continued to shine with a sharp light. He formed a seal with his hands and let out a low roar. Suddenly, a token rose from his body. The token seemed to be made of mysterious ice. When it appeared, it caused the cultivators inside to shiver. It could be seen how intense the chill was. In the next moment, Luo Rong directly cut his finger and dripped a drop of essence, blood, on the token. Immediately, Luo Rong looked as if he had lost his essence and spirit, and he became extremely dispirited. However, the token turned into a stream of light and flew out. In an instant, it began to emit a chill. The token floated above Han Fenglu's head. Immediately, countless icicles appeared around him, blocking his path. Han Fenglu had no choice but to stop moving forward. Looking at the black ice that was constantly rushing out, his heart suddenly shook. He let out a low roar, and the bamboo staff began to emit a dim light again to resist the cold. The mysterious ice token. Han Fenglu looked at the icicles that were shining with a cold light and felt a chill in his heart. As the top geniuses in the 3,000 worlds, they naturally knew each other. For example, Lei Dingtian had 3 supreme skills that were extremely powerful. Luo Rong not only had supreme skills, but he also had a very good weapon. Although it was only a lower sage level weapon, its power was not bad. This mysterious ice token could be said to be his life-saving amulet. Of course, if the mysterious ice token was used together with 1,000 miles of mysterious ice, its power would not be weaker than a middle sage level weapon. Fortunately, Luo Rong was unable to use the 1,000 miles of mysterious ice in his current state, so the power of the token was naturally greatly reduced. Therefore, Han Fenglu still had a carefree expression on his face. He didn't panic in the slightest, because everything was still under control. In the next moment, the icicles flew up and hit Han Fenglu. After Xiao Yang killed the first dead spirit, the tip of his spear pierced through the second one at the same time. However, at this moment, several forces also landed on his body, and he was directly sent flying. Xiao Yang immediately stood up and tilted his silver spear. His eyes were filled with coldness. The second dead spirit suddenly began to roar, and in the next moment it exploded. The lightning began to rage again. The moment Xiao Yang was sent flying, he had already infused the power of lightning into it. His goal was naturally very clear. Killing one of them would naturally reduce the pressure on him. When the other 5 dead spirits saw that one of their companions was suddenly gone, they immediately looked at the silver spear with more fear in their eyes. They knew very well that this young man looked like a rank 8 Kingwu, but he had a silver spear that restrained their attributes. Its lethality was very tyrannical. If they continued to fight, even if they could kill him, how many of them would they be able to obtain? The dead spirits began to waver in their hearts, but soon the tyrannical control made them rush forward again without a care for their own safety. It could be said that this time the charge could be said to be involuntary. After they became dead spirits, they still had to be controlled by someone. It was very sad. Xiao Yang did not retreat and rushed forward again. Chapter 1811. High up in the sky, Princess Mingzhu's face turned paler after a few tough battles. Looking at him now, he looked like a man covered in blood. Her heart was filled with helplessness at the moment. She did not expect to be defeated here. During this period, Princess Mingzhu even took out a few life-saving talismans, but they only managed to injure her opponent. Su Muhua had also gained a lot in the past 1,000 years, not to mention how many techniques he had learned. Just his physical body alone had already reached the point where he could not feel pain. Moreover, he was very tough and was many times stronger than ordinary cultivators. This was the so-called gain and loss. Even though Su Muhua might lose the so-called righteous path forever, the power and benefits he gained were not to be underestimated. Looking at Princess Mingzhu, whose breath had become extremely weak, Su Muhua shook his head helplessly and sighed. This woman was too fierce, and the magic treasures on her were impossible to guard against. He had been hit a few times, and his injuries were not light. However, because he could not feel pain, he could completely ignore it. I'm very curious. How long can you hold on for? Su Muhua said as the corners of his lips curled up slightly. The more the prey resisted, the more excited he was. As for the situation below, there was no need to take a look. If Han Fenglu could not deal with a bunch of old and weak soldiers with such a strong lineup, what use was there for him? Princess Mingzhu snorted coldly. She held her sharp sword in front of her chest, and the nervousness from before was reduced by a lot. It seemed like she had understood the current situation, so naturally, she was not so worried anymore. As for how long I can hold on, you can try. Princess Mingzhu snorted coldly and shouted. Instantly, the smile on Su Muhua's face became even wider, but at the same time, it became even more perverted. At the same time, he knew very well that his opponent was almost at the end of her life. She was just bluffing. He had long been used to such situations. Perhaps in the beginning, he was a little unsure. However, he had clearly seen the battle just now. Therefore, he understood what was going on. The next moment, Su Muhua's expression changed slightly. He sensed a little and realized that there were 3 dead spirits missing. Immediately, he was shocked. Although only the 3 weakest ones were gone, the people below them didn't have any ability to fight anymore. How did they die? For a moment, how could Su Muhua not be shocked? Very quickly, he sensed the violent nature of the lightning energy. Suddenly, he felt that this matter was somewhat interesting. Originally, he thought that only one woman would be able to shoulder the burden this time. He did not expect that King Wu, a rank 8 man, would be extraordinary. This was somewhat unexpected. Su Muhua also realized that this battle had dragged on for long enough, so it was time to end it. It wasn't something that Su Muhua could do just because she wanted to, but she had made enough preparations beforehand. Therefore, he was only missing a small factor to completely crush that woman. After Princess Mingzhu suppressed the surging qi and blood in her body, she raised her sword again. In her opinion, it was just a battle. As for the outcome, she didn't care. However, she would draw her sword. Even if she didn't have the slightest bit of spiritual energy, she would still draw her sword. She couldn't hesitate in the slightest. Even if she was going to die, she would die from exhaustion. Seeing the golden light, Su Muhua felt that it was very dazzling. However, that desire could not be suppressed. Therefore, in a flash, he threw a punch at him. Immediately, the originally brilliant golden light dimmed under this punch and was almost extinguished. Even Princess Mingzhu's figure was shaken to the point of shaking, as if she was on the verge of collapsing. The woman's tenacity was not inferior to a man's. With a low cry, she stabilized her body that was about to fall. At the same time, she swooped down, the sword in front of her, and rushed over. Since she had already reached this point, she naturally had nothing to be afraid of. All of this seemed to be within Su Muhua's expectations. He once again threw out a punch. The sound of explosions could be said to be one after another, whether it was in midair or on the ground. The silver lightning spear in Xiao Yang's hand continued to release thunderbolts. The power of the explosions was extremely violent and unstoppable. After the spear in his hand sent the third undead spirit away, there were more injuries on his body. Even 2 of the ribs in his chest were broken. Now that the energy in his body was almost depleted, if this continued, it was only a matter of time before he was defeated under the siege of these undead spirits. Unrivaled God, who was watching from the side, was very anxious when he saw that Xiaoyang was almost unable to hold on. He looked at the magic weapon in the sky. If Xiaoyang was holding this sword, would the situation be different? The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he felt. However, without the Thunderfire Divine sword's protection, they would definitely be in big trouble. If that happened, the undead spirits would no longer be fighting Xiaoyang and would pounce on them instead. That would really be a situation where they would have a slim chance of survival. Nothing could be taken for granted as they imagined. However, there was nothing they could do. That was the real torture. While Unrivaled God was thinking, Xiaoyang had already killed another undead spirit with a thunderous attack. Because of this, he paid the price once again. His spine had been beaten to the point where cracks had appeared. The more he was in a situation like this, the less Xiaoyang cared about gains and losses. To him, as long as he could eliminate a living force, it was not a big deal even if he had to pay a price. If the stalemate continued, that would be the real horror. Another spear strike and another undead spirit was destroyed. It was very decisive. However, Xiaoyang's left calf bone was broken. He gritted his teeth and persevered, allowing beads of sweat to fall continuously. He had no intention of retreating at all. Right now, Xiaoyang looked like a killing god. He did not care about gains and losses. All he cared about was killing his enemies. Everyone who saw this was shocked to the core. This was a madman. Suddenly, Xiaoyang glanced behind him and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. A thunderbolt came roaring like a raging dragon. Chapter 1812. That bolt of lightning seemed to contain the might of heaven and earth. It was inviolable. Although the remaining 2 undead spirits had rank 9 strength, they trembled in fear. They did not dare to fight back at all. They did not even dare to move an inch. The fear that came from the bottom of their hearts made them panic a little. It was as if they were about to be annihilated. There was no way to change that. They could only wait for death to come. Han Fenglu, who was temporarily blocked by the black ice token, had mixed feelings. He had also sensed the approaching aura. At the same time, he knew who it was. However, such overwhelming power was a little unexpected. A glimmer of hope rose in Unrivaled God and Luo Rong's hearts. However, in the next moment, it quickly disappeared without a trace. This was because they knew that it was a mixed bag. Xiaoyang saw that the 2 undead spirits were panicking. He immediately suppressed the speculation in his heart. Instead, he pointed his spear again and nailed one of the undead spirits. With a loud roar, the lightning exploded. The undead spirit screamed in pain and was blown to pieces. In the next moment, the other undead spirit seemed to have sensed that something was wrong. It wanted to escape, but it was too late. This was because an aura had already locked onto it. At the same time, a bolt of lightning struck and killed it directly. The method was decisive and the power was terrifying. The bolt of lightning struck the ground, causing it to shake. Gradually, everyone saw the person's true appearance. The tall and mighty man was holding a big hammer. There were dragon-like bolts of lightning lingering on the hammer. Xiao Yang glanced at him. He had many thoughts in his mind, but he was not in a hurry to say them out loud. At this moment, Han Fenglu growled. With all his might, he waved his bamboo staff. Immediately, the black ice token was knocked away. In the sky, Princess Mingzhu and Su Muhua seemed to have sensed the overwhelming power. They stopped what they were doing and looked down. Lei Dingtian, Han Fenglu said, frowning slightly. Who would have thought that such an impossible change would happen? Moreover, according to his guess, Lei Dingtian was poisoned and severely injured. Then he was hunted down. Logically speaking, he should not have recovered so quickly. However, his current aura had become incomparably powerful. It did not seem like he was injured at all. The corners of Lei Dingtian's mouth lifted slightly. He glanced at Xiao Yang. Then his gaze fell on Han Fenglu. Lei Dingtian, I think you can see the current situation clearly. You should know which side to join, Han Fenglu said in a low voice. At the same time, Han Fenglu's mentality began to change. Lei Dingtian's appearance would indeed affect the situation. Although his martial aunt Su Muhua had the ability to decide the outcome of the battle, there were too many accidents. He didn't want more. Join you? When Gu Shun attacked me, the grudge was already set, Lei Dingtian said coldly. The reason why Gu Shun did not gain anything was that he wanted to take advantage of Lei Dingtian. However, he underestimated the ability of a rank 9 upper tier. In the end, he could only escape with serious injuries. That was why he did not gain anything. This was also why Han Fenglu could determine Lei Dingtian's condition and was sure that he would not appear here. However, the result was unexpected. He still came. Gu Shun is dead. However, Xiao Yang and Bai Jian, who killed your brother and forced your father to his death, are still here. Han Fenglu shouted. Hatred could easily sway a person, especially when he was angry. Then, the choice he made would not be so rational. Xiao Yang still did not move. He was not sure whether the person who came was an enemy or a helper. Therefore, he did not dare to act rashly. Lei Dingtian looked at the hammer in his hand and said, I have already reached a deal with Xiao Yang. Since he handed over the Holy Thunder Hammer, I will accept it. Therefore, after this matter is over, it will not be too late to settle the grudge between him and Bai Jian. After saying that, Lei Dingtian still did not look at Xiao Yang. Lei Dingtian was such a person. If he wasn't willing to help, he wouldn't have picked up the Holy Thunder Hammer. He wanted to take it back fair and square. He did not want to raise the price and add insult to injury. Moreover, this matter was related to the realm of the gods and Princess Mingzhu. How could he stand by and do nothing? As for the Greenly realm, although Han Fenglu was a top figure and was very good at scheming, in the end, it was still a small matter in his eyes. Hearing this, Xiao Yang's face relaxed. He knew that he had made the right bet this time. In the letter, Xiao Yang had explained everything clearly. The antidote and explosive elixir were left in the bottle. As long as Lei Dingtian took them together, he would be able to recover to his peak and even be stronger than before. Although Lei Dingtian could put aside his grudges for the time being for the sake of the big picture, he was unwilling to look at Xiao Yang. He felt that this was his bottom line. Han Fenglu gritted his teeth. He really did not expect this outcome. Looking at the tired young man who was trembling all over, he had no intention of backing down. Suddenly, Han Fenglu understood. Xiao Yang's departure was probably part of his plan. He did not expect that he would use the Holy Thunder Hammer as bait to get Lei Dingtian to intervene. It turned out that everything was part of this guy's plan. How hateful! Han Fenglu, who was sure of his victory, now realized that someone's scheming and control of the situation was not inferior to his. It could only be said that Han Fenglu had been overconfident after thinking that the situation was set. That was why he gave Xiaoyang a chance. After hearing this, unrivaled god secretly heaved a sigh of relief. As long as Lei Dingtian was willing to put aside his grudges for the time being, everything was negotiable. As for what would happen next, that would be a matter for the future. Moreover, after this cooperation, it was not impossible for them to become friends. Although the hope was very slim, at this moment Xiaoyang took out a pill slowly and swallowed it slowly. He had not taken any pills from the beginning in order to deal with the Greenly Realm's evil intentions. When it came to the battle with Han Fenglu, he still did not use any. He wanted to make the final decision now. After swallowing the pill, his broken bones began to heal immediately. The spiritual power that he had lost was also rapidly restored at this moment. Immediately, Xiaoyang's entire spirit was shaken. The fatigue and dispiritedness from before were swept away. Chapter 1813. After sensing that Xiaoyang's aura had completely recovered, Han Fenglu's eyes were filled with shock. Immediately, his gaze became a lot more malicious. With how intelligent he was, he naturally understood exactly what was going on. However, he did not expect Xiaoyang to be so patient. It was terrifying. Lei Dingtian took a step forward and pointed the Holy Thunder Hammer at Han Fenglu, saying, "Today, let me see how strong you are, despicable person from the Greenly world." Suddenly, Han Fenglu's expression changed. He had used up a lot of energy before. Now that he was facing Lei Dingtian, who was known for his strength, and he was still at his peak state, his chances of winning were very slim. At the same time, he looked up at Sumu Hua in the sky. At that moment, Princess Mingzhu forced herself to take a deep breath and stood with her sword. Her intention was very clear. She would definitely stop Lei Dingtian. It could be said that Lei Dingtian's appearance had ignited hope in everyone's hearts. It could be said that this battle was no longer as hopeless as before. There was still a chance of victory. Su Muhua glanced at him and snorted, saying, "This woman will definitely be defeated in 3 moves. If you can't hold on, you don't have the right to continue." Hearing this, Han Fenglu's heart calmed down. Forget 3 moves, he could even do 300 moves. It was just that he did not have a chance of winning. This did not mean that he could not fight. "You go and help Princess Mingzhu. Leave Han Fenglu to me." Xiaoyang took a step forward and said. Lei Dingtian nodded and rose from the ground without any hesitation. He did not even bother to ask. Of course, this was not because he was unhappy with Xiaoyang and wanted him to die in Han Fenglu's hands. Since he had fought with Xiaoyang and knew how powerful he was, it would not be a problem for him to defeat Han Fenglu. Moreover, Lei Dingtian also felt that if Princess Mingzhu was defeated, Sumu Hua would be like a hot knife through butter. Moreover, this person was the most difficult to deal with. As for Xiaoyang's chances of winning, that was not something Lei Dingtian could care about. Sumu Hua looked at Lei Dingtian, especially the holy lightning hammer in his hand. Suddenly, her heart throbbed a little. It could be said that he was instinctively afraid. However, the advantage that came from one's strength could make up for it. With the sudden appearance of such an opponent, Sumu Hua also felt that it had become a lot more interesting. Lei Dingtian nodded slightly at Princess Mingzhu before his gaze landed on Sumu Hua. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. It was his first time facing such an opponent. Furthermore, from Xiaoyang's letter, he knew that this Sumu Hua was a genius who had reached the Type 9 realm 1,000 years ago. By now, he was likely already at the pinnacle. In fact, he was only half a step away from that level. Now he could sense from the other party's aura that his strength was indeed that strong. Therefore, no matter what, it was going to be a bitter battle. On the other hand, Princess Mingzhu was already at the end of her rope. The combat power that she could unleash was probably very limited. So what if there's one more person? Do you think you can surpass the barrier of the realm? Su Muhua sneered. In his opinion, this so-called hope was just a joke. It was not enough to reach the apex. Even though Lei Dingtian was infinitely close to the peak of the Type 9 realm after taking the explosive elixir, he still couldn't step into it. The explosive elixir could indeed forcibly raise one's cultivation level. However, after reaching the Type 9 realm, the elixir's effect seemed to be lacking. However, compared to before, it was indeed much stronger. Therefore, he didn't hesitate and directly smashed the hammer over. Since the elixir's effect only lasted for an hour, he had to cherish it. At the very least, he had to severely injure him during this period of time. Otherwise, the situation wouldn't be optimistic. In addition to being optimistic, Luo Rong also became much more sorrowful. Although Su Muhua was indeed not as powerful as Venerable Sky Inch, they had used the 12 Heavenly Stems formation and the Tripartite formation to defeat her by working together. Now they were fighting alone. It couldn't be compared to before. Brother Luo, don't think too much. Recover quickly and help as much as you can, Shen Wushuang said resolutely as he sat cross-legged. Luo Rong nodded slightly and began. Since they could hold on for now, they had to cherish this little bit of time. After all, if they hesitated in sorrow, they might let their last chance of winning slip away. That would be the most sorrowful thing. Han Fenglu looked at Xiaoyang, gnashing his teeth in hatred. It was this wild mountain cultivator who came out of nowhere that caused his originally flawless plan to constantly have accidents. Even now, there was a possibility that his plan would fail at the last minute. Although the possibility of that happening was very small, Han Fenglu was still very angry. Xiaoyang, I have to admit that you're indeed worthy of the title of champion. It's just a pity that we're rivals and not friends. Otherwise, if we work together, the 3,000 mini-worlds will be ours, Han Fenglu said coldly. Sometimes one had to admit that reality was just so frustrating. Furthermore, Xiaoyang had only come back because his friend was here. That was why he had decided to fight for a chance of survival. Therefore, it was impossible to get him to work with him. Therefore, Han Fenglu felt very helpless. Xiaoyang smiled faintly and said, Your plan won't work in the first place. You've underestimated the God Realm. Han Fenglu would never admit to that no matter what. That was because, in his opinion, Xiaoyang was the only unforeseen event. As for the God Realm, he could totally deal with it with ingenuity. Xiaoyang felt a little helpless when he saw the other party's stubborn look. Some people were very smart. They often thought that they had everything planned out because of this kind of thinking. Little did they know that some things were not logical and would happen as they wished. Although there are some accidents now, so what? You still can't change the outcome. Han Fenglu said coldly, With Su Muhua, an almighty with absolute power, no matter how many unforeseen events you had, it would still be gaudy and unable to withstand a single blow. Xiaoyang did not argue with him. Instead, he laughed coldly. With a wave of his hand, the thunder fire divine sword flew to his side. Now that the dead spirit was gone, there was naturally no need for a guard. Chapter 1814. The thunder fire divine sword floated in front of Xiaoyang, exuding a faint radiance. However, the berserk intent within it had been accumulating for a long time, but it was still being suppressed. Xiaoyang took a deep breath. He could also feel that Xiaohua was about to devour Heihua. Therefore, all he could do now was to stall for time as much as possible. If he could wait for Xiaohua to appear, then the victory would be set. Therefore, before that, he had to be careful. High up in the sky, there were continuous roars. It could be said that lightning flashed and thunder roared, almost lighting up this part of the world. At the same time, there were also some golden lights that were extremely dazzling, like golden lotuses blooming. It looked extremely beautiful. However, there was a hidden killing intent. If an ordinary cultivator were to be hit by it, they would probably die. There was no way to save the situation. Explosive shouts rose and fell one after another. The battle above was also very intense. Han Fenglu did not raise his head to look. Princess Mingzhu was now an arrow at the end of its flight. She could not pose any threat at all. As for the aggressive Lei Dingtian, after all, he was only in the upper tier of the 9th level. Compared to his martial uncle Su Muhua, the difference was not ordinary. Therefore, this aggressive aura was only temporary. Once his aura was exhausted, he would not be able to continue, and only death would await him. Therefore, Han Fenglu felt that as long as he got rid of the trouble that was Xiaoyang, and then kill all those eyesores, then everything would be foolproof. Looking at his opponent, Han Fenglu also exhaled deeply. At the same time, his gaze became much more vicious. From his point of view, all the variables were because of this leader. Otherwise, everything would be foolproof. Therefore, if he wanted to eliminate all these variables, there was only one way to choose, and that was to eliminate him. Then, everything would be over. Looking at the divine sword that was shining with lightning and fire, Han Fenglu felt that it was extremely dazzling. One had to admit that the mid-grade sage-level magic weapon was indeed extraordinary. It was no wonder that it was the prize for the leader. No matter how one looked at it, it was very perfect. However, no matter what, this leader was only at the 8th level of Kingwu. The huge gap in terms of cultivation level was not something that could be easily made up for in a short period of time. Xiaoyang stared at his opponent. As for the battle above, he did not care about it for a while, but he still had to worry. After all, they didn't know how long they could hold on. At least during this period of time, he had to end the battle quickly and defeat Han Fenglu. If he could not do it, the situation would worsen. Previously, he could defeat Lei Dingtian of the 9th level of the battle, so he was very confident that he could fight with Dingtian and even win. Immediately, Xiaoyang growled and pointed with his finger. Immediately, the Thunderfire Divine Sword drew a ray of light and charged towards Han Fenglu. The Thunderfire Divine Sword's sword chi immediately leaked out. The two types of sword chi had their own merits. They were full of power, as if they wanted to obliterate everything. Seeing this, Han Fenglu sneered disdainfully. Immediately, her hands began to form a seal. The jade bamboo cane began to emit a faint light again. However, it was very different from before. This was because the light looked even more strange, as if it came from hell. Seal! Han Fenglu growled. Immediately, the jade bamboo cane began to grow rapidly. The Thunderfire Divine Sword pierced into the bamboo cane and no longer appeared. In the blink of an eye, the bamboo stick had already turned into a gigantic bamboo. For a moment, Xiaoyang could not sense the Thunderfire Divine Sword. Suddenly, his expression changed. He had never thought that Han Fenglu's bamboo cane would have such a wonderful use. It was likely that after the bamboo cane was cast, it had temporarily become an object that isolated the world. That was why the Thunderfire Divine Sword was trapped and isolated from the chi movement. Fortunately, the strange bamboo cane stood there as if it could no longer move. This was still acceptable. Moreover, the jade bamboo cane's grade was not as good as the Thunderfire Divine Sword. In terms of sharpness, it was even worse. Therefore, even though he was sealed now, it was only temporary. It wouldn't be long before he could break free. Using a low-grade sacred level Dharma artifact to trap a mid-grade Dharma artifact, in Han Fenglu's opinion, was a sure win. Moreover, in his opinion, the reason why Xiaoyang was so confident was only because of the prize of being the champion. Without the Thunderfire Divine Sword, his strength would be greatly reduced. Although his secret technique could only trap the Thunderfire Divine Sword for an hour, it was enough. In his opinion, killing Xiaoyang would not even take half the time it takes for an incense stick to burn. Immediately, Han Fenglu let out a low growl and grasped the void with one hand. Suddenly, dots of sharp light gushed out like a flood. It could not be stopped at all. The domineering aura rose spontaneously as if he was the most powerful person in the world. The look in unrivaled God's eyes changed immediately. This was because this aura was very different from the Han Fenglu that they knew. Previously, Han Fenglu had been very refined. Even though he was scheming, he was still very sinister. However, at this moment, his aura had changed completely and became extremely domineering. Even Luo Rong could not help but turn pale with fright when he sensed the change in the aura. His eyes were fixed on Han Fenglu. As expected, among the four of them, Han Fenglu was the one who hid his strength the best. And he must have done this for the sake of this shocking plan to succeed. That's why he did this. Many people were shocked when they thought of this. Han Fenglu was too good at hiding his strength. It was hard to predict. One had to admit that this level of patience was not something an ordinary person could achieve. In a flash, a large saber appeared in Han Fenglu's hand. The saber looked extraordinarily domineering. The majestic body of the saber was a stark contrast to Han Fenglu's weak body. Immediately, even the corner of Xiao Yang's mouth could not help but twitch slightly. The saber was engraved with a fierce tiger. The tiger's teeth were like the teeth of a sword. They were exposed and looked ferocious. Han Fenglu wiped the saber gently. The smile at the corner of his mouth became much more carefree. He said softly, "I think the name decapitation is the most appropriate for this saber." Chapter 1815. The full name of the saber was the Tiger Tooth Beheading Saber. It was the most outstanding weapon in the green glass world. Before Han Fenglu obtained the emerald bamboo cane, he had relied on this saber to roam the world. Later on, he gradually switched to using the emerald bamboo cane. That was why others thought that he was just a weak scholar. That was just a side of Han Fenglu that he could show after scheming. Moreover, when he roamed the world with the Tiger Tooth Beheading Saber, he used another name. That was why no one knew his background. They only knew what they knew now. Xiao Yang looked at the Tiger Tooth Beheading Saber and frowned slightly. This was because he could feel that the murderous aura on the saber was very strong. It was impossible to cultivate such a murderous aura unless one had killed countless people. Sometimes one could make a lot of conclusions just from one's aura. It had to be said that the opponent in front of him was really good at hiding herself. Soon after, Xiao Yang sucked in a breath of cold air. From the looks of it, they still had to face a tough battle. Even the outcome of the battle was hard to predict. Therefore, he had to be 120% focused to face the enemy. He could not afford to make the slightest mistake. Otherwise, he would be doomed eternally. The silver lightning spear seemed to be provoked. The lightning on it became even stronger at this moment. It was as if there was endless anger that wanted to be released. It was very agitated. "Take this!" Han Fenglu roared. He raised the saber in his hand and slashed down. Suddenly, a majestic saber essence was released. It was as if the sky was about to be split open. Seeing the ferocious saber essence coming towards him, Xiao Yang roared and forcibly blocked it with a long spear in his hand. Suddenly, the saber essence fell. Xiao Yang's entire body trembled. It was as if he could not withstand the huge force. Fortunately, his physical state was higher, so his strength was even more extraordinary. He could barely withstand it and used the power of lightning to break it. However, the situation did not improve. Han Fenglu had already rushed over. The saber in his hand slashed wildly. It was like a torrential rain of pear blossoms. It could be said that this saber technique was not fanciful at all. It was just fierce and domineering. The momentum was unstoppable. Every slash was extremely domineering and had an extraordinary aura. Xiao Yang also relied on his strong physical body. In addition to his willpower, he attacked with his spear crazily. He blocked the saber essence of the saber, but it did not hurt him at all. For a time, the two of them were locked in a fierce battle. Saber light and spear shadows could be said to rise and fall one after another. The two were also secretly competing with each other. revealing their murderous intent. However, they were evenly matched. It would be difficult to determine the victor in a short period of time. Wave after wave of blade intent and spear intent continuously swept out, causing the ground around them to be ravaged and filled with potholes, rising and falling one after another. The more Xiao Yang fought, the more shocked he was. Han Fenglu, who looked gentle, had become extremely violent. Song Zhongling, who was carrying a saber, was almost no different from a child in front of him. Even though Xiao Yang's body was strong, he was still somewhat suppressed in the face of Han Fenglu's crazy attacks. This was what shocked Xiao Yang the most. He had never thought that such a situation would occur. This was really unexpected. Things could not always be so smooth. Xiao Yang was also aware of this. However, he was still looking for an opportunity to find his opponent's weakness. It could be said that Han Fenglu had many flaws. However, because of the incomparably fierce saber technique, these were perfectly covered up. If he wanted to forcefully break through the flaws, he would probably have to suffer a blow first. It was even possible that he would be beheaded. This was also the reason why Xiao Yang did not dare to act rashly. He could only passively defend. If he revealed even the slightest flaw, it could lead to an irrecoverable fate for him. It was like walking on a single-plank bridge. If one was not careful, one would fall into a bottomless abyss and be unable to save oneself. On the contrary, Han Fenglu seemed to be more and more excited after this crazy attack. Every swing of the saber seemed to be from his heart. Moreover, he was still attacking wildly, but it also made it impossible for one to take advantage of him. It could be said that it was extremely painful. No matter how patient Xiao Yang was, under such circumstances it was worn out. He wanted to fight back, but he could not find the slightest opportunity for a while. It was very uncomfortable. However, this was also something that could not be helped. No matter how indignant one could only forcefully endure it. As long as one waited for one's opponent to make a mistake, it would be time to counterattack. However, Han Fenglu was in existence at the greater mastery of the 9th stage. He had also gone through many bloody storms and had rich battle experience. How could he have such a flaw? Moreover, when a powerful person began to become cautious, the chances of defeating him would become very slim. Han Fenglu was very happy to fight, but at the same time he was very surprised. Now that he had gone all out, he even brought out his trump card. He did not expect Xiao Yang to be able to withstand it. As expected of the champion of the grand competition, his strength was extraordinary. Han Fenglu had also heard about the battle back then. Now, it seemed that the champion in front of him definitely did not use his full strength back then. Otherwise, the champion of the hidden dragon role, Xinwu, would probably become a complete joke. However, to Han Fenglu, killing such a genius was indeed a very satisfying thing. As a result, he increased the strength in his hand even more. Xiao Yang, on the other hand, seemed to be having a hard time blocking it, although he would occasionally counterattack under the obstruction of the tiger-toothed guillotine saber. He could only return empty-handed in the end. The more Shen Wuxuan watched, the more shocked he became. He even had a vague feeling that he was perhaps the most powerful among the 3 greater mastery of the 9th stage. Of course, this was caused by the contrast. It was hard for anyone to accept that a weak scholar had suddenly become so strong. Gradually, Yang Sun and Luo Ku woke up one after another. Watching the fierce battle in front of them, they had different expressions. Seeing this situation, Luo Ku understood in his heart that Xiao Yang was not lucky in that battle back then. His strength was there for all to see. It was just that Luo Ku was short-sighted. Chapter 1816. High up in the sky, lightning flashed and thunder rumbled. Lei Dingtian held the holy thunder hammer with both hands, panting heavily as if he was exhausted. Princess Mingzhu had also withdrawn from the battle. After delivering the last blow, the energy in her body was completely depleted. Therefore, she could only return to the ground. After consuming a pill, she began to recover her strength. Lei Dingtian faced Su Muhua, who was much more powerful than him, but he was still fearless. In fact, he thought that he still had a chance of winning. The reason was very simple. The holy thunder hammer in his hand was a natural counter to the tomb keeper. However, everything was not as simple as he thought. The power that Su Muhua displayed was even more heaven-defying. It was as if she turned a blind eye to the thunder and lightning. She kept fighting back with a punch, forcing him to retreat. It was as if she was not afraid of the power of the thunder and lightning. She was very fierce. The thunder cloud, a ritual implement that he had refined himself, was also constantly releasing thunder and lightning to attack. However, it could only seal his movements. It could not cause any real harm to him. This made Lei Dingtian feel helpless. Now that he was facing an opponent who was much more powerful than him, he was very helpless. However, his competitive heart did not allow him to retreat like this. In fact, he thought that if he could hold on, he might even be able to improve his cultivation. Therefore, this battle seemed a little unusual in his eyes. The worse the situation was, the more he wanted to fight to prove himself. Who knows, maybe he would succeed. However, reality was very cruel. Lei Dingtian had already used 3 of the thunder god's 5 hammers, but it did not cause much trouble for his opponent. This made him feel very helpless. I didn't think that a barren place like the Thousand Thunder Realm could produce someone like you. How rare. Su Muhua's lips curled up slightly as she praised him. These words made Lei Dingtian feel a little uncomfortable. In the eyes of this top genius from 1,000 years ago, the Thousand Thunder Realm was just a barren place. However, the Thousand Thunder Realm could not be compared to the Greenly Realm. It could be said that Lei Dingtian was the only top genius that appeared in the Thousand Thunder Realm in a few thousand years. For example, in the Greenly Realm, at least one would appear every 1,000 years. It's not easy to reach this point. Why do you have to leave yourself here? Su Muhua said with some regret. Although Su Muhua felt that it was a pity, for the sake of her great cause, she could only bear the pain and kill him. After all, if the matter here was exposed, the consequences would be unimaginable. Lei Dingtian grinned. His eyes were filled with pity for this senior from 1,000 years ago. No matter how strong you are, that was a matter from 1,000 years ago. And now, you're nothing more than a tomb keeper, someone who has lost his footing on the path of the great Tao. Then, Lei Dingtian leaped up, roared, and swung his hammer down. The 4th hammer strike was directly struck out. Regardless of whether it was effective or not, he had to give it a try. If he didn't even dare to make a move when facing an enemy, then he would be a real coward. As the hammer fell, the sky seemed to tremble. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning thicker than a water bucket fell down towards Su Muhua. It could be said that it was the power of 5 bolts of lightning striking the top of the head. Su Muhua's expression suddenly changed at this moment. The thunder god's 5 hammers stacked on top of each other, becoming more and more powerful. Now even he was moved. He felt that this young man was indeed a threat to him. This caused him to feel extremely displeased in his heart. Soon after, he roared angrily and charged upwards. It was as if he was still not afraid of the lightning and wanted to take it head-on. Seeing this scene, even Lei Dingtian himself was extremely surprised. This was because the visual impact was simply telling him that he had no advantage in terms of attributes. It was very unlikely for him to win. Although he had such doubts, his confidence was incomparably firm. He didn't dare to show the slightest sign of discouragement. If he showed even the slightest sign of discouragement, he might lose immediately. Su Muhua drove her own strength and directly collided with it. Immediately, the sound of the explosion was endless. The sound of the explosion rose and fell one after another. It could be said that the sound was monstrous. After a while, the lightning died down. Su Muhua was suspended there. Even though her body was charred black, her aura had weakened a lot. However, the playful look in her eyes was very unpleasant to see. It was as if the damage that the lightning caused to her was like a tickle. It had no effect at all. Admittedly, Lei Dingtian's temperament was better. However, in the face of this situation, he still subconsciously inhaled a cold breath. If this was the case, what was the point of continuing the fight? His proudest technique didn't seem to hurt the opponent. No matter how fierce it seemed to be meaningless. The more he thought about it, the faster Lei Dingtian's confidence was worn down. It could even be said that the situation before him was difficult for him to accept. However, the truth was right before his eyes. He had no choice but to admit it. Even his hands were trembling. It was obvious that he was feeling guilty. Su Muhua still looked pleased with herself. She stared at her opponent with a curious look. This made him feel uncomfortable all over, and he could not help but criticize her in his heart. At this moment, Unrivaled God and Luo Rong took the lead while Luo Ku and Yang Sun assisted. The four of them worked together to form a Four Guardians formation. They were prepared to use this to restrict Han Fenglu. As long as they could obstruct her, Xiaoyang would definitely have a chance. Moreover, this was the only thing they could do at the moment. As for the Five Elements formation, because Shen Jinyi was unconscious and Bai Jian was focused on recovering, they could not assemble it. They had no choice but to save themselves. This was the only way. Immediately after the formation of the array, the aura in the surroundings changed rapidly. In an instant, Han Fenglu also felt that his qi had been somewhat restricted. Even his blade intent had become much slower as a result. Although she did not turn around to look, Han Fenglu already knew in her heart that those fellows had joined forces to set up a formation to target her. At that moment, Han Fenglu was furious. She had not been in a hurry to get rid of all of them. She did not expect them to start causing trouble for her now. Chapter 1817. Han Fenglu was also a little unhappy. He wanted to kill all the old and weak soldiers behind him with a single slash. However, he did not have such an opportunity because he could only use fierce attacks to seal Xiaoyang. If he relaxed, it would be equivalent to giving his opponent a chance. By then, he would probably suffer a great loss. This was akin to a very tricky knot, which made one in a dilemma. This was because no matter what choice one made, it would not be the right one, and one would more or less have to pay a price. Even though the four people did not have much spiritual power left, and the formation was not powerful, there was very little that could seal Han Fenglu's qi momentum. Even so, there was still a fly in the ointment. After sensing that Han Fenglu's qi momentum was restricted, Xiaoyang sighed a breath of relief. Soon after, he pulled himself together and attacked with his spear like a dragon. At this moment, there was an extremely subtle change in the situation. For a moment, the fierce attacks forced Han Fenglu to switch from offense to defense, and he could no longer attack as he wished. At the same time, Han Fenglu shouted and slashed with his saber. He knew very well that if the battle continued, he would gradually fall into a disadvantage, so he had to take a risk and forcefully break the current situation. Seeing that his opponent suddenly attacked, Xiaoyang frowned slightly, and he already knew what was going to happen. Soon after, he could only raise his silver spear to block the saber. At that moment, a sonorous sound was heard, and it was as deafening as the roar of a giant beast. Xiaoyang was shaken to the point that the ground caved in, and even the surroundings cracked like a spider web, layer by layer. Han Fenglu also borrowed the force from the recoil to quickly pull away. At the same time, he turned around and charged toward the Four Symbols formation. From his point of view, it was necessary to eliminate all of those forces. Even if they could not pose a threat, it was really annoying for them to do something in the dark. Therefore, Han Fenglu's move just now was for this purpose. He knew that Xiaoyang would definitely attack when he regained his senses. But as long as he could kill these people, it would be worth it. This kind of transaction was still quite worth it. Unrivaled God and the rest panicked when they saw Han Fenglu charging towards them personally. Now that they no longer had any protection, they were completely powerless in front of Han Fenglu. In fact, he could only allow himself to be slaughtered. For a moment, Luo Rong was filled with despair. Originally, he thought that he could save himself by doing this, but he didn't expect that he would anger Han Fenglu and cause his death to come faster. Bai Jian continued to sit there as if he had completely entered a meditative state. He was completely indifferent to the situation before him, as if it had nothing to do with him. At this moment, Xiaoyang leapt up from the ground and charged forward with his spear in hand. At the same time, he performed a hand seal with his other hand with a determined look on his face. Suddenly, the space in front of Han Fenglu trembled. Mount Tianqin appeared abruptly and blocked Han Fenglu's path. Han Fenglu frowned slightly when he saw the saint-level dermic weapon appear out of nowhere. He had to admit that this opponent of his seemed to have endless tricks up his sleeve. Not only that, he even had a few saint-level dermic weapons, which made him feel rather helpless. However, Han Fenglu still slashed down with his saber, causing Mount Tianqin to retreat. However, it also blocked his path, preventing him from hurting unrivaled God and the rest behind him. No matter how one looked at it, it was not an easy task to break through Mount Tianqin. At least, with Han Fenglu's current cultivation base, it would still take some time. However, Xiaoyang would not give him that much time. Moreover, he had already arrived. At that moment, Han Fenglu did not dare to continue fighting. He quickly retreated and had no choice but to give up on the idea in his mind. It seemed that he had to defeat Xiaoyang in order to kill those old and weak soldiers. Otherwise, there would be no chance at all. This chief's methods could be said to be endless. Even at this point, he was still able to protect these people with his own strength. It could be said that he was very terrifying. Luo Rong heaved a sigh of relief when he saw Mount Tianqin blocking Han Fenglu's attack. He had thought that he had reached the end of his path. However, it seemed that he could still prolong his feeble existence. However, Luo Rong still felt rather uneasy. Although his life was not in danger for the time being, it was hard to say how long he could last in this situation. However, he was now completely convinced of this chief's abilities. As a rank 8 Kingwu, he was able to fight Han Fenglu, who was at advanced rank 9. Not only was he not at a disadvantage, but he was also able to take care of others. One had to admit that his techniques and cultivation base were extremely terrifying. Unrivaled God, on the other hand, took a deep breath. He still looked like he had yet to recover from the shock. However, he was certain that he could trust his friend at any time. After pulling away, Han Fenglu looked at Xiaoyang and frowned. After Mount Tianqin landed, it seemed to have taken root. It stood there like a natural moat, blocking Han Fenglu's advance. Although Han Fenglu was a little unhappy about this, Xiaoyang only had a silver spear in his hands now. If he dared to move the mountain, he would reveal his weakness. I've really underestimated you. It's just that with such a huge drain, how long can your pills last? Han Fenglu smirked and said disdainfully. However, deep down, Han Fenglu was very impressed with this opponent of his. Unfortunately, they had been on opposite sides since the beginning. Therefore, no matter what, it was impossible for them to become friends. Xiaoyang did not look at Unrivaled God and the others. He raised his silver spear and said in a low voice, "You don't have to worry about that." Han Fenglu laughed when he heard that. However, he was also paying close attention to the changes in his opponent's aura. It seemed that Xiaoyang was getting braver as the battle progressed. There was no sign of him being defeated at all. This point made people feel a little apprehensive, and they also didn't understand. It was just his personality. Such a drain on his strength would not be a long-term solution. With that thought in mind, Han Fenglu gripped his tiger-toothed guillotine tightly and prepared to launch the next round of attacks. In his opinion, Xiaoyang was only relying on the miraculous effects of the pills to be able to fight him. Would he still be able to fight after the pill's power was completely exhausted? Of course, the answer was no. Therefore, as long as he kept exhausting his opponent, his chances of winning would be very clear. Chapter 1818. Therefore, Han Fenglu was very clear about what he should do next. However, he still found it difficult to calm down. This was because his opponent was only King Wu, who was only at level 8. Yet, he was able to face him head-on. Could it be that he was not strong enough? This kind of self-doubt was completely eliminated in the next moment. If he, Han Fenglu, was really not strong enough, how could he have reached this step today? It could only be said that Xiaoyang was a freak. He was an anomaly. Even if they were the top geniuses, they would not be able to do what Xiaoyang did. At this moment, Xiaoyang's eyes became much colder after he had completely resolved his worries. Now, the battle with Han Fenglu was indeed very difficult for him. He did not even have a chance of winning. It was very slim. However, he could not be timid. He could only fight with all his strength and win. Otherwise, his good friends might all be buried here. If he wanted to leave, he could naturally do it. However, he would not be able to live up to his own conscience. Xiaoyang was not that kind of person. At this moment, Han Fenglu placed the tiger tooth beheading blade in front of him. Suddenly, a domineering blade essence surged out. The surrounding atmosphere seemed to be affected to a certain extent. The aura was like ripples that swept out wave after wave, shaking one's soul. This kind of aura could be said to be very domineering. It was obvious that Han Fenglu could not hold it in anymore. Of course, his view was very simple. He could not let the situation continue to be in a deadlock. Therefore, he had to end it as soon as possible. In an instant, the huge pressure came to Xiaoyang. He knew that Han Fenglu was about to launch a very powerful attack. When that time came, whether he could still withstand it was still a question. However, he still did not have the slightest bit of fear. As the saying goes, when the water comes, the earth will block it. Since he had chosen to face it, he naturally had to endure it. Soon after, he took a deep breath and his eyes were filled with determination. So what if it was an all-out battle? He wasn't at a disadvantage before, so he might not be at a disadvantage in a battle of martial skills. Han Fenglu suddenly moved. At this moment, the large saber in her hand was even more ferocious. The sound of the saber breaking through the air was like the roar of a ferocious tiger. It resounded through the forest and shook everyone's soul. Behind the sky, Qin Mountain, Unrivaled God, and the others could not help but feel their scalps tingle when they heard the piercing sound. As for those with slightly weaker strength, such as Yang Sen, their minds had also become somewhat injured, and they appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Even Xin Jinyi, who had fainted, began to twist his body. His expression became one of extreme pain. Clearly, he had suffered a great deal of torture, which was why he was like this. Li Chuanyi was also awakened at this moment. He hugged his head in pain, feeling very uncomfortable. As for Bai Jian, he was still in a meditative state. It seemed that no matter what the situation was, it would not affect his current state. Luo Rong was still all right. His cultivation base was profound. Although he was weak, he could still suppress the discomfort. Therefore, he did not suffer too much damage. Looks like we've underestimated Han Fenglu. He's always been the kind of person who stands at the back and assists others. I didn't expect him to be as powerful as Lei Dingtian, Luo Rong said with a wry smile. It could be said that before the Jade Pool Grand Banquet began, the 4 geniuses from the outside world each had their own unique characteristics. Although Bai Jian's cultivation base was the lowest, he was the most outstanding. Coincidentally, Han Fenglu was the complete opposite. He could be said to be extraordinarily refined and gave people a very comfortable feeling. Many people even thought that Han Fenglu might have extraordinary attainments in sorcery. However, now it seemed that he was also a fierce person. As for his previous gentleness and elegance, it was just a disguise. Shen Wushuang laughed helplessly and said, "It's true that you can't judge a book by its cover. I didn't expect the Greenly realm to have such a grand plan." Luo Ku, on the other hand, sat there in a panic. He originally thought that he would definitely shine in the God Realm Grand Tournament. He did not expect to be defeated in the end. He was even manipulated like a puppet in the tomb of the God of Sin. Even now, he could not do anything in this dangerous situation. That feeling of helplessness was something that everyone here felt. However, each of them had a different mentality. That was because of their different attitudes toward Xiaoyang. The whistling sound became more and more tyrannical and deafening. Xiaoyang, who was facing this pressure directly, was also very uncomfortable. He knew that this aura was getting stronger and stronger. He was afraid that it would be difficult to resist it. However, he was not a coward. Although he knew that this attack was difficult to resist, he still did not have the slightest intention of retreating. Instead, he perked up and quickly waved the silver spear in his hand. Suddenly, the majestic lightning will also surged out at this moment. It was like the anger of a ferocious beast. Once it began to vent, it was already unstoppable. Bolts of lightning swam around his body like a pool of lightning. It was difficult to invade. The divine will also completely burst out at this moment. It was as if he had completely merged with the lightning element. It could be said that he was very handy and unusually domineering. At this moment, even Lei Dingtian and Su Muhua, who were high up in the sky, had a slight change in their expressions. Although the two of them were locked in a fierce battle, they were still aware of the situation below. Due to the fact that lightning element restrained them, Su Muhua was especially sensitive to it. As for Lei Dingtian, because he was too familiar with it, it was easy for him to sense it. Naturally, Lei Dingtian knew the reason as well. It was all because of the miraculous effects of the nightmare thunder fruit. That was why Xiaoyang was so powerful. Otherwise, even if he could play with the silver lightning spear, he was afraid that he would not be able to display the true meaning of it. At this time, Han Fenglu also felt it. At the same time, his blade fell. Since he knew how terrifying his opponent was, he naturally did not dare to slack off. Therefore, this time, he even took out his trump card. It could be said that no one here knew about these moves. It was enough to catch them off guard. Originally, these were all left for Princess Mingzhu. He did not expect that Xiaoyang would come out of nowhere and use them against him. Fortunately, he had martial uncle Su Muhua. Tiger kill! Chapter 1820. No matter how ferocious the blade aura was, the young man continued to charge forward. The silver spear in his hand seemed to have been greatly provoked, and the might of the lightning became even stronger, as if it could not be defied. Under the violent impact, countless blade auras were quickly shattered as if they could not withstand a single blow. However, that was only a sensory change. Every force that exploded was very tyrannical. It was also because Xiaoyang's physique was very strong. Otherwise, how could he withstand it? Moreover, his aura was even more invincible, as if he was fearless. He only cared about moving forward and did not care about anything else. Even if there were thousands of difficulties and dangers, they could not stop his momentum of moving forward. Seeing that Xiaoyang was getting closer and closer to him, Han Fenglu's expression became much more unpleasant at this moment. He did not expect that this guy would act as if he did not care about his life. It was really terrifying. At the same time, Han Fenglu's eyes also emitted an even stronger murderous intent. Since you want to go against the flow, I'll let you know that it's meaningless. So what if you're rushing over? You can't change anything in the end, because everything was predestined. In an instant, Xiaoyang had already arrived. He raised the silver spear high and directly smashed down with terrifying power. Even though he was already an arrow at the end of its flight, he still managed to exert a considerable amount of strength. Suddenly, even the space around them was compressed as if it would explode in the next moment. It was very terrifying. Han Fenglu also immediately slashed out with his blade as if he was ready to fight to the death with his opponent. It was just a battle, and he was waiting for his opponent to be exhausted. It could be said that he had taken advantage of it. Although the power of this blade was not as terrifying as before, it was still not to be underestimated. The blade had yet to arrive, but the saber intent had already arrived. Fortunately, the will was strong enough and did not collapse, so Xiaoyang was able to withstand it. His attack did not change because of this. There was no turning back for an arrow that was shot. That was the principle. Boom! The two forces collided at this moment, and immediately a ferocious aftershock spread out. Xiao Yang was not discouraged because of this. Instead, his killing intent became even stronger, because he could clearly see that now was the best time to follow up with a victorious pursuit. He absolutely could not have the slightest intention of retreating. Seeing that Xiao Yang actually wanted to continue fighting after this confrontation, Han Fenglu was a little surprised. Could it be that this person was really a monster? However, he didn't dare to take even half a step back. He immediately slashed out with his saber. If he retreated now, he was afraid that Xiao Yang would continue to stand up and attack. At that time, once he was suppressed, the consequences would be unimaginable. Therefore, this could be considered a battle of personal feelings. Sometimes, if you softened your tone, you would become weak and easily bullied. Han Fenglu was well aware of this. Therefore, he used all his strength in this attack. Even if he couldn't injure Xiao Yang, he had to at least force him away. Otherwise, the situation would become even worse and harder to salvage. In that instant, Xiao Yang seemed to have realized Han Fenglu's thoughts. However, he couldn't stop. He could only fight. Even if it was difficult, he still had to try. Instantly, the saber and spear collided. Both of them seemed unwilling to retreat, so their attacks became even fiercer. Even though they were both arrows at the end of their flight, they still crazily squeezed out the energy in their bodies. The masked woman, halfway up the mountain, watched the crazy battle between the two and shook her head helplessly. However, the way she looked at the current chief changed again. This man could be said to be full of guts. However, in the realm of the gods, he was incomparably low-key until the start of the grand competition. Why was that? These questions were becoming more and more difficult to understand. However, the more she thought about it, the more she thought about it. It was surprising. After exchanging a few blows, both of them began to run out of strength. In the last collision, both of them were forced to retreat several feet before finally coming to a stop. Xiao Yang relied on the support of the silver lightning spear to not fall. However, his face had become very pale. Even his entire body had begun to tremble. Obviously, he had suffered a great loss. That was why he was like this. It could be said that Xiao Yang's current state was very bad. Many cracks had already appeared on his internal organs under the impact of the huge force. In addition to the crazy consumption of his energy, it was inevitable that his body couldn't bear the burden. The current Xiao Yang could be said to be completely overloaded. However, this was something that couldn't be helped. It was just a pity that the previous attack didn't succeed. In the end, it fell short of success. It was indeed a bit of a pity. However, Xiao Yang didn't regret anything because of this. Although it was a bit of a pity, he wasn't strong enough. There was nothing to be angry about. In the next moment, a stream of blood slowly flowed out from the corner of Xiao Yang's mouth. He was really somewhat unable to suppress the berserk energy in his body. Han Fenglu was also in a very sorry state. After he stabilized his aura, he stared at Xiao Yang and laughed loudly. Haha, this is really satisfying. It's been a long time since I had such an intense battle. Han Fenglu said. He looked a little crazy. Previously, Han Fenglu had always maintained his cultured and refined image. After reaching the 9th level, he had never gone all out in a battle. However, he didn't expect that the person who could fight with him to his heart's content wasn't the original opponent in his eyes. It was someone who was at a lower level than him. Now he felt a sense of empathy. However, he quickly suppressed this thought. The corner of Xiao Yang's mouth twitched slightly. He then smiled helplessly. He had to admit that he had underestimated Han Fenglu. At the very least, this opponent was much stronger than he had expected. He was even stronger than Lei Dingtian. This feeling could be said to be very strong, and the experience could be said to be very terrible. However, under such circumstances, he could only grit his teeth and persevere. He continued to fight and look for an opportunity. Although Unrivaled God and the others had joined forces to set up the Four Guardians formation, Its power was completely blocked because of the Sky Qin Mountains barrier. Therefore, Xiaoyang was still fighting alone. He was fighting Han Fenglu, who was waiting for an exhausted opponent all by himself. At this point, his strength was almost exhausted. If the stalemate continued, the situation would be unpredictable. Heavenly Sword Dao. Chapter 1821. The young man who was sitting on the ground suddenly opened his eyes. His gaze was as sharp as a sword gleam. Even the people around him could not help but tremble when they sensed the sharp aura. It felt as if a sharp sword was constantly slicing their bodies. It was extremely unbearable. At the same time, it made them feel incomparably terrified. It was as if life and death were on the line. It was difficult for anyone to change that, so they were a little afraid. Luo Rong, an unrivaled god, looked at the young man in white with a sword. He sat there, his sword intent pouring out as if it was unstoppable. Bai Jian seemed to have completely entered a state of selflessness. His eyes were bright and his aura was strong. Suddenly, he pinched his fingers together, and the sacred Dharma weapon, sword, swept into the sky. A stream of light flashed and disappeared. At that moment, the sword aura disappeared without a trace. It was as if it had only bloomed for a brief moment. It seemed to have ended just like that. However, Bai Jian pressed his fingers down in the next moment, and the overbearing aura exploded once again. It was as if a ferocious beast that had been sleeping for tens of thousands of years had suddenly awakened. It roared angrily, and its might shook the heavens. Heavenly Sword asks. Suddenly, the sword appeared high up in the sky. However, at this moment, it became incomparably huge. The sword seemed to have come from the heavens, carrying with it endless heavenly might. It would slay any god or devil that stood in its way. The sword aura was brilliant, and it was invincible. When Han Fenglu sensed the impending danger, she lifted her head to look. She saw the gigantic sword suddenly appear and fall on her head. Suddenly, Han Fenglu's expression changed drastically, and he became absent-minded. Han Fenglu had always thought that Bai Jian was just a sharp sword gleam. However, such a person would break at any time if he showed off his abilities. Therefore, he had never paid much attention to it. He did not expect Bai Jian to suddenly attack at such a critical moment. Furthermore, from the might of that sword strike, he was able to sense that it was immeasurably powerful. However, Han Fenglu no longer had such thoughts. It could even be said that she had completely refreshed her understanding of Bai Jian. He also knew that his previous thinking was completely wrong. This white sword was indeed as sharp as it was rumored to be. Although it was easily broken if it could be unsheathed, it would still be an extraordinary existence. So what if he was one small realm lower in the 9th stage? However, his lethality could not be ignored. It was enough to make him tremble with fear. Sure enough, Stage 9 Heavenly Sword Realm cultivators were the most unreasonable existences. Even though their cultivation levels were insufficient, their destructive power was extremely terrifying. However, Han Fenglu did not think that she would fail like this. At the same time, she was somewhat unconvinced. The thought of giving it a try flashed through her mind. Immediately, Han Fenglu let out a low roar and charged forward with the tiger tooth beheading blade in her hand. Immediately, the spiritual energy in his body began to pour out like a majestic tide. Suddenly, the shadow of a large saber appeared around him. It was a magnificent and vast sight. Xiaoyang stood at the side and was not in a hurry to make a move. Instead, he held the long spear in his hand horizontally. Immediately, his expression changed drastically. He knew very well in his heart that it was time to decide the victor. Since Bai Jian had already made a move and used all his strength in this attack, it could be said to be a fatal blow. If he did not seize this opportunity, once Han Fenglu caught her breath and Su Mu Hua returned to help, the consequences would be unpredictable. Therefore, Xiaoyang had to give a fatal blow in the situation that Bai Jian had fought for and decide the outcome of the battle. Under the circulation of her spiritual energy, The power of thunder began to converge at this moment, preparing for an even more powerful killing move. At this moment, Han Fenglu seemed to have completely ignored Xiaoyang and only wanted to compete with Bai Jian. Soon, the sword and saber collided with each other. With just a slight contact, a huge force spread out at this moment. It was very terrifying. The two forces of the saber and sword collided and crushed each other. It was extremely terrifying. Saber Dao could be said to be extremely domineering and overbearing. However, the sword energy was even sharper. No matter how strong one was, the sword would still pierce through. It could be said that there was no logic to it. In an instant, Han Fenglu sensed that the situation had begun to change. Immediately, her expression turned extremely ugly. Indeed, it was not much different from what she had expected. The sword was truly unparalleled. Although the sound of breaking could be heard continuously, the sharp sword continued to pierce the shadow of the large saber. Although the progress was not very fast, it was not slow either. Bai Jian was still in a pressing posture. It could be said that he had already gathered all of his strength into this sword strike. It could be said that this was a desperate move. If it did not succeed, it was easy to imagine the outcome. Unrivaled God and Luo Rong were also protecting Bai Jian with all their might to avoid any mishaps. They were also very sensitive and were even more aware of the current situation. The sound of shattering could be said to be incessant for a time. Countless sword qis spread out in all directions. It was as if a goddess was scattering flowers. However, wherever they passed, even the space was cut open. It was clear how sharp they were. Han Fenglu held the tiger-toothed guillotine saber above her head and allowed the sword to fall. At the same time, her own aura poured out continuously. Soon, the tip of the sword was pressed against the body of the saber. Immediately, Han Fenglu's entire body began to fall rapidly under the tremendous force. At the same time, the tip of the sword kept breaking against the guillotine's saber. It was a spectacular sight. Seeing that the huge sword was completely broken, Han Fenglu's lips curled into a smile. The lethality of this move was only SO. However, in the next moment, Han Fenglu's expression froze. A painful expression occupied her brows. He saw a sharp sword piercing through his back. Unfortunately, after the sword flew 30 feet away from her body and was about to turn around for another attack, it lost its strength and fell to the ground. At this moment, Bai Jian, who was controlling his sword in the distance, had exhausted all his strength and collapsed to the ground. At this moment, Bai Jian's face was pale. Even his breathing had become much weaker. Han Fenglu glanced at the wound on her lower abdomen and frowned slightly. She did not expect that there would be such a hidden attack. It was impossible to guard against it. At this moment, Xiaoyang made his move as well. He waved the silver spear in his hand, and lightning burst forth. Thunder dragon roar of 1,000 poisons. Chapter 1822. As the saying goes, a spear shot out like a dragon. As soon as the spear shot out, a majestic bolt of lightning rushed out and turned into a huge divine dragon. It bared its fangs and brandished its claws. The sound of thunder was like a dragon's roar, deafening. Han Fenglu looked up and saw the lightning dragon rushing towards him. His first reaction was to block it with the tiger-toothed beheading blade. However, because of the pain from his abdomen, his movements paused for a moment. Moreover, when he blocked Bai Jian's attack just now, he had used up too much of his strength. He could not continue. In the blink of an eye, the lightning dragon had arrived. Han Fenglu could not block it at all. Suddenly, the lightning dragon poured into Han Fenglu's body and began to weave in and out at an extremely fast speed. It was very fierce. Han Fenglu growled in pain. He wanted to get out of this situation, but he was powerless. Every time he tried to use his qi to block it, it would be scattered by the lightning dragon. Therefore, he could not succeed and could only endure it unwillingly. As long as he could withstand this attack, there was still a chance. Therefore, Han Fenglu gritted his teeth and persevered. He steadily protected his qi so that there would not be the slightest mistake. Xiao Yang glanced coldly and then looked up at the sky. The masked woman, halfway up the mountain, saw that Xiao Yang did not even look at her opponent's result. Wasn't this a little too arrogant? This made people feel that she was a little arrogant. High up in the sky, it could be said that there were bursts of thunder and lightning. The situation was very intense. It wasn't that Su Muhua didn't want to go down and help Han Fenglu, but Lei Dingtian was holding on to him so tightly that he couldn't divert his attention to help Han Fenglu, so he was in a terrible fix. Su Muhua looked at this junior in the Thousand Thunder realm. Although he admired him very much, he also had a very strong impulse to kill him or even grind his bones to ashes. Only then would he be able to appease the resentment in his heart. From the very beginning, Lei Dingtian had been giving it his all. He launched a very fierce attack and did not hold back at all. Although Su Muhua didn't seem to be afraid of the power of thunder, that was just an illusion. She wanted to make her opponent feel that she didn't have any advantage at all. However, his approach did not succeed. Lei Dingtian was not afraid because of this. Instead, he became more and more courageous as the battle went on. He even became fiercer and fiercer without any scruples. It wasn't until Lei Dingtian used the fourth hammer of the Thunder God's 5 hammers that the situation began to tilt. Su Muhua was injured, and it wasn't light. Even the death aura that had gathered over the past 1,000 years was scattered a little. Unfortunately, despite Lei Dingtian's natural talent, he did not fully understand the essence of the 5th hammer. Therefore, he was unable to unleash its full potential. Otherwise, it would be enough to severely damage the other party's vitality. It was also after the 5th hammer strike that Su Muhua realized that she could no longer be arrogant, so she began to fight back. Who knew that Lei Dingtian was indeed a cultivator of the Thousand Thunder realm? His body was tough and his strength was equally formidable. Coupled with the help of the Holy Thunder Hammer, it was easy for him to use his techniques. It was very casual and easy. More than half of the several dangerous attacks had been blocked. Therefore, even though Lei Dingtian was also heavily injured, he still stood there stubbornly, blocking Su Muhua's path. Lei Dingtian's bones were broken, but he still held the Holy Thunder Hammer tightly. Between his brows, there was a look of fighting to the death. It was as if since he had promised something, he must do it. Even if he had to give up his life, it seemed that he would do it. On the other hand, Lei Dingtian only looked as calm as Mount Tai on the surface. In his heart, he still hoped that Princess Mingzhu would attack again. Otherwise, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to hold on. After all, he wasn't willing to give up his life here. However, under such circumstances, if he were to retreat, he would be a laughing stock. At least, he wouldn't allow himself to do such a thing. Su Muhua frowned slightly as she looked at the flashing lightning above. She had to admit that this young man did have some tricks up his sleeve. If it wasn't for the gap of 1,000 years, it would be hard to say who would win. However, Su Muhua knew very well that she had to end this quickly. Moreover, she had to end this quickly. Due to too many unstable factors, they had entered a stalemate or even a complete disadvantage. Su Muhua also wanted to end this quickly, but her strength wasn't at the level where she could change things as she wished. For example, just now when he wanted to help Han Fenglu, he was stopped. She could kill Lei Dingtian, but it would take some time. However, during this time, whether Han Fenglu could still be alive would be another matter. Regarding this, Su Muhua had a headache. He really couldn't figure it out. It was clearly such a simple matter. So why did that idiot drag it out until his life was in danger? Coming to this point, he was really stupid to the extreme, and it was difficult for others to understand. Such was the fickle nature of things. No one could predict what would happen next. Unrivaled God and Luo Rong looked at Bai Jian, who had fallen once again. Both of their expressions had turned grim. However, they couldn't guess what the situation on the other side of the mountain was like. Therefore, they were very upset. However, they didn't dare to act rashly because they were afraid of causing trouble for Xiaoyang. now that they could protect themselves. That was the greatest help they could provide. Therefore, they could only stay here for now. They didn't dare to investigate at all. However, after the dragon's roar, the world became much quieter. This made them carefully sense the situation. They wanted to know what was going on. Han Fenglu looked at the chief in front of her and frowned slightly. The power of this move didn't seem to be as strong as she had imagined. At this moment, Xiao Yang suddenly retracted his gaze. He coldly glanced at them and immediately charged forward with his silver spear in hand. Han Fenglu sneered disdainfully. In her opinion, Xiao Yang must be overconfident. That was why he dared to charge over so recklessly. Since you want to die, I'll fulfill your wish. Therefore, Han Fenglu was ready to raise her sword and kill this person. However, everything was not as she had imagined. Han Fenglu felt her limbs go weak. She was completely out of control. A cold gleam flashed. The silver spear pierced the heart. Chapter 1823. Han Fenglu lowered his head and looked at the silver spear in his chest. His brows were filled with confusion. He really couldn't figure out what was going on. That spear was so ordinary. Why couldn't he move? Why couldn't he block it? For a moment, countless questions surfaced in Han Fenglu's mind. However, there were just too many questions. He could not come up with an answer that could convince him in such a short time. His heart was filled with anguish. The masked woman who was halfway up the mountain also felt that it was very strange. Why didn't Han Fenglu block or dodge that seemingly ordinary attack? Why did he take it head-on? Princess Mingzhu would never believe that Han Fenglu had suddenly thought things through and felt that he could only atone for his sins with his death. This was because she thought that it was impossible for such a person to change his mind so easily if he could plan for such a long time. However, sometimes things were just that strange. No matter how many thoughts one had, it was difficult to change. One would not know what had happened. Why? Han Fenglu still could not believe that this was the outcome. He felt terrible as he questioned. What happened just now was too strange. He could not figure out why it had turned out this way. Therefore, he desperately wanted to know the answer now. At the very least, he needed to know how he had died. However, Xiao Yang did not reply to him. Instead, he shook the silver spear in his hand. Instantly, a huge force exploded out at this moment. Lightning flashed, and Han Fenglu's body was torn to pieces. Even his god soul was not spared. Another spear strike destroyed his soul and made it cease to exist. He was very decisive in his attack. There was no hesitation at all. Of course, Xiao Yang would not show mercy to such a schemer with evil intentions. At the very least, he had to be ruthless when dealing with his enemies. Immediately, Xiao Yang waved his hand. The Sky Qin mountain rose from the ground and flew into the sky. Since Han Fenglu was dead, there was no need for him to continue protecting unrivaled God and the rest. Instead, he could make the most of them by getting them to help him. At the same time, the huge jade-green bamboo cane rapidly shrank, and the Thunderfire Divine sword flew out as well, circling around Xiao Yang's body. When unrivaled God saw the battle, there was no trace of Han Fenglu. There was not even the slightest trace of her aura. This puzzled everyone. What exactly had happened to make this happen? They were sure that Han Fenglu had probably been annihilated by now. However, they did not expect Xiao Yang's ability to be so terrifying. It was unbelievable. Xiao Yang quickly collected the emerald bamboo staff, the tiger tooth guillotine, and some storage treasures left behind by Han Fenglu. After all, the most important thing now was to get rid of his biggest opponent, Sumu Hua. It could be said that he was the one who decided everything. If he could not kill him, then all his previous efforts would have been in vain. When Sumu Hua sensed that Han Fenglu had died, he went berserk. He sent Lei Dingtian flying with one punch and was ready to kill him. However, he did not succeed because the thundercloud appeared and blocked in front of him. However, he was sent flying with one punch. However, After the thundercloud flew out, a huge mountain appeared and blocked his way again. Su Mu Hua punched again, causing the Sky Qin mountain to tremble as if it was about to fall apart. It was extremely domineering. At this moment, Xiaoyang arrived in front of Su Mu Hua. Even though he was exhausted, he still had to step forward. He could not take even half a step back. He did not expect Lei Dingtian to put in all his effort and not run away because of the seriousness of the situation. This made him look at him in a new light. Su Mu Hua stopped his attack because he did not have enough energy left. If he attacked forcefully, it would be difficult. He had no choice but to do so. He frowned slightly as he looked at the unprepossessing and even battered opponent in front of him. It could be said that the changes in the situation were all because of this person. It made him feel very helpless and uncomfortable. "You brat, you are very courageous and powerful." Although Su Mu Hua was praising him, he said it through gritted teeth. He did not hide his hatred because, in his opinion, this was the person who ruined his junior nephew's plan and ruined the great cause of the Greenly world. Xiaoyang looked at him for a while, then put away the silver lightning spear and replaced it with the thunder fire divine sword. The reason why he chose to use the silver spear in the battle with Han Fenglu was very simple. It was easy to use. In addition, he could use the martial technique he was most proud of, but that was because of the poison. Han Fenglu could not move at that time because she was affected by the poison and he did not know it. However, Su Mu Hua was just a tombkeeper. The poison would not have much effect on him, so he might as well use the thunder fire divine sword. No matter which attribute it was, it had a strong restraining effect. Therefore, this was the best choice. The thunder dragon roar of 1,000 poisons was mainly about its poison. It was a pity that the two powers of the thunder fire divine sword were too domineering. There was no way to hide it, and it could not be used together. It was a pity. Of course, if the technique was good enough and familiar enough, it could be used successfully. As for how effective it could be, no one knew. Lei Dingtian was also standing beside Xiaoyang with the holy thunder hammer in his hand. He did not even glance at Xiaoyang. Instead, he stared at Su Mu Hua. "I can't hold on for much longer. I'm afraid Princess Mingzhu won't be able to do anything for a while," Lei Dingtian said worriedly. Moreover, he also felt that Xiaoyang's aura was very weak. He probably could not use much of his strength. "If I take them with me now, won't I be hunted down when the morale collapses?" Xiaoyang said calmly. Hearing this, Lei Dingtian's original intention to escape by a fluke immediately stopped. If he waited for them to leave, he might not be thinking of a life and death struggle. When the time came, it would be difficult to hold on without the determination to cut off all means of retreat. Sometimes the battle of morale was just as important. He did not expect to fight side by side with his enemy one day. Chapter 1824. Although Lei Dingtian no longer had any intention of retreating, he still felt uncomfortable in his heart. He knew very well that this battle was destined to be a tough one. It was a battle that was difficult to continue, and there was no way out. Even if he performed exceptionally, the final result would still be unsatisfactory. Temporarily putting aside their grudges and fighting side by side, how much could they change and how much could they increase their chances of winning was still a big question. These were things that one could not help but think about carefully. Who knew when a huge change would occur and they would fall directly into the abyss? Even if it was a dead end, they could only force themselves to fight. Even if they were to break their heads and bleed, there was no other way. Moreover, the choice that he could make now was so simple. It was just a fight to the death. However, Lei Dingtian still, subconsciously, turned his head to look at the person he resented. If he still had some tricks up his sleeve, he might be able to change the current situation. However, if it was still the same as before, then it would really be a dead end. Xiaoyang seemed to have felt Lei Dingtian's gaze as well. He let out a helpless, bitter laugh. Now, Su Mu Hua was furious. It was impossible for her to have a proper discussion and let this matter pass. At this moment, Su Mu Hua let out a low roar and suddenly, an endless amount of death aura gathered in her body at an extremely fast speed. Obviously, she did not want to continue fighting and wanted to end everything. Xiaoyang and Lei Dingtian also subconsciously gasped. They knew in their hearts that there was no way out and they could only fight to the death. Therefore, they immediately separated and prepared to fight. Lei Dingtian took the lead. While driving his instrument, Thundercloud, to begin a thunderous bombardment, he waved the Holy Thunder Hammer and launched an attack. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, held the Heavenly Qin Mountain in one hand and the Thunder Fire Divine sword in the other, exerting pressure on his opponent. In this battle, both of them did not hold back, for sacred instruments were activated together. They wanted to fight with all their might. Even though they knew that they were no match for him, they still had to try. Who knew there might be a chance? As long as there was even the slightest chance, they felt that they would definitely be able to seize it. Su Muhua saw Lei Yun and Shan Shan pressing towards him together, but he did not have the slightest intention to retreat. He roared and opened his hands. Suddenly, black gas surged. It was like a black cloud pressing down on the city. He directly attacked the two. Suddenly, the two saint-level magic tools seemed to have suffered a great impact and were sent flying. At this time, Lei Dingtian's attack had also arrived. A hammer came down. The power of thunder was unparalleled. Su Muhua's body flashed and dodged the thunderous attack. She also rushed towards Lei Dingtian at an extremely fast speed. It was obvious that she wanted to kill him and wanted to end the battle as soon as possible. However, Lei Dingtian was by no means a frivolous person. He naturally knew the intentions of his opponent. Therefore, he used offense as defense and struck out with his hammer again. At this moment, Bai Jian had also caught his breath. He lifted his head to look at the intense battle in the sky, and his brows furrowed tightly once again. Just now, he had accumulated power with his sword and cooperated with Xiaoyang's attack to successfully kill Han Fenglu. However, Su Muhua, who was above him, was not someone who could be easily killed by forcing an opening. Not to mention that Su Muhua's strength was much stronger than Han Fenglu's. Just the fact that he was now a tomb keeper was already very different from ordinary cultivators like them. Therefore, it was difficult to use the same method to kill him. Moreover, Bai Jian's previous sword attack had almost exhausted all of his sword momentum. Now, if he wanted to gather it again, he was afraid that it would take a long time. Whether Xiaoyang could hold on until then was also a huge problem. Therefore, Bai Jian was powerless to do anything now, and he was very upset about this. Luo Rong was extremely shocked. He did not expect Xiaoyang's strength to be so terrifying. Previously, when he killed Han Fenglu, he had already exhausted a lot of his strength. Now that he was facing Su Muhua, he still looked like he would not rest until he was dead. This was very strange. Could it be that this person was really a monster? Did he not know what fatigue was? In his heart, he was full of admiration. All the prejudices he had heard before turned into nothingness when he saw it with his own eyes. Although unrivaled God knew Xiaoyang very well, he still felt that it was not enough. At the same time, he was very glad that he had made such a good deed in a moment of impulse. This also gave him a slight chance of survival in this trip to the tomb of the God of Sin. Unrivaled God could not even imagine that if he had not given up his spot, or if he had not insisted on persuading Xiaoyang back then, they would probably have become corpses under Han Fenglu's scheme by now. In the end, the God of Sin might really become Han Fenglu's under her scheme. Although the situation was extremely hopeless, that person had given them a glimmer of hope. Furthermore, step by step, that glimmer of hope was still expanding. Xiaoyang did not hold back at all. Every time he attacked, he was extremely fierce. Although there was not much energy left in his body, he did not dare to be calculative. This was because if he were to show any leniency, he might put his companions in danger. Although this was a good opportunity to kill with a borrowed knife and eliminate Lei Dingtian, Xiaoyang still could not do something so immoral. The enmity between them did exist. Lei Dingtian had even wanted to kill Xiaoyang before. However, since Lei Dingtian had accepted this deal and was doing his best, Xiaoyang naturally would not have any dirty thoughts. Lei Dingtian also felt that the person was attacking with all her might. Sometimes, she would even deliberately block some attacks for him. He felt more or less satisfied. The enmity from before did exist. However, now they had put aside their prejudices and personal grudges to fight against the enemy together. What would happen in the future was not clear. However, at this moment they were comrades. Su Muhua's attacks were still methodical. However, the cooperation between the two of them was really watertight. This made him very unhappy. Therefore, when he attacked, he became more and more powerful. Although he could not say that he was going against two arrows at the end of their flight, his chances of winning were very high. As long as the two of them showed the slightest flaw, only death would await them. Plunder like fire. Chapter 1825. The sword aura was like fire, scorching hot. Although the sword was clearly tired and its power had decreased a lot, it was still an existence that could not be underestimated. Due to the sword chi's characteristics, it had a suppressive effect. Thus, it could also have some extraordinary effects. Su Muhua snorted in disdain when he saw that the sword chi was so light. Then he smashed his head against it. He was so dauntless that in the face of such a powerful attack, he could still maintain a fearless momentum. Perhaps from Su Muhua's point of view, his thinking was that simple. He wanted to meet force with force and face fear head-on. If sometimes he showed too much fear, it might make others think that he was weak and easy to bully. He could continue to expand this point. It could be said that this was also a psychological game. Unfortunately, his luck did not seem to be very good because Lei Dingtian and Xiaoyang did not change their way of attack. They were still the same and could be said to be doing things their own way. The flaming sword aura arrived in front of Su Muhua in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, the black fog also emerged continuously, obviously wanting to block this tyrannical attack. The flaming sword aura continued to sweep through, and the black fog was also dissipating at an extremely fast speed. However, at the same time, the sword aura was also being destroyed. So what if there was some element of restraint? Su Muhua's foundation was really too deep, so she could be so fearless. Rushing head-on was enough to make the opponent tremble in fear. He was so capricious that he could be so strong. Although the flaming sword aura was tyrannical, it was still somewhat insufficient in front of Su Muhua. However, some of the flaming sword aura still slashed mercilessly on his body. Wherever it passed, it would leave wounds. There was even a trace of flame on it that was burning fiercely. However, soon, there was a continuous attack of black energy, extinguishing all the wisps of flame. It was a very spectacular scene, and people could not help but be a little dumbfounded. Su Muhua was obviously angry, so he did not show any mercy. In the blink of an eye, he rushed in front of Xiaoyang and blasted out a punch. His speed was simply too fast. Even though Xiaoyang's reaction speed was not bad, it was still too fast. However, under this situation, he could only helplessly place the sword in front of his chest to prevent this fist from directly immobilizing him. Fortunately, Xiaoyang blocked it, and the fist smashed onto the divine sword. However, under that huge force, he was still unable to withstand it and was directly sent flying. Boom! He slammed into the Tianding mountain. Instantly, he felt extremely uncomfortable. A trace of blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. His internal organs were on the verge of shattering, and he didn't even know how many of his bones were broken. The gap in strength was so huge that, sometimes, it was not something that could be made up just by thinking about it. It could be said that it was indescribably painful. His cultivation had completely surpassed King Wu's realm. It could be said that he was almost invincible in the tomb of the god of sin. If it were not for the fact that he and Lei Dingtian's attributes could restrain their opponent, they would not have been able to fight at all. Lei Dingtian saw that Su Muhua was ready to continue attacking Xiaoyang. Obviously, he wanted to kill him. He did not dare to hesitate and immediately rushed over. Now, their situation could be said to have reached a point where they would be intimately interdependent. It could be said that no matter who was missing, the end result would be very bad. Therefore, all he could do now was to help each other as much as possible. Although sometimes the result would not be satisfactory, if he did not do anything, he would be waiting for death. Su Muhua's path was blocked by Lei Dingtian. Suddenly, a sense of irritation rose in his heart. Immediately he rushed over, as if he was ready to get rid of this slightly troublesome opponent first. Looking at the holy thunderhammer that was shining with lightning, Su Muhua's eyes were still filled with disdain. This was because, in his opinion, so what if the weapon was strong? If you couldn't unleash all of its power, then it would be meaningless. Therefore, he could completely ignore it. Su Muhua's attack was still as simple as ever. It could be said to be plain and simple. What he wanted was the effect of every punch hitting flesh. As for the rest, there was no need to think about it at all. It was still so fast that it could not help but make people feel a little unprepared. However, Lei Dingtian did not return to defend. Instead, he swung the hammer with all his might. In his opinion, the worst result would be a loss for both sides. He could still bear the consequences of such a small loss. Therefore, he did not give up too much. This was how it was in a life and death struggle. Sometimes it could be said that if one gave it their all, there would be a surprise. In the next moment, Lei Dingtian took a punch and flew out directly. He looked very miserable. However, his hammer also fell and hit Su Muhua's waist. Under the huge force, he could not control his body and fell down at an extremely fast speed. At this moment, Xiaoyang also flew out. He did not even look at the marks he left behind on the Tianding mountain. Instead, he charged toward Su Muhua. There was a great opportunity in front of him. How could he miss it? It could be said that this was an opportunity that could not be missed. It would not come again. In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang arrived. However, Su Muhua suddenly stabilized his body. It was unbelievable. Another punch was thrown and Xiaoyang flew out again. However, this time, Xiaoyang did not choose to block. The thunder fire divine sword in his hand flew out and directly pierced into Su Muhua's heart. It could be said that he did not show any mercy. Suddenly, the power of thunder and fire exploded at this moment. Immediately, the left side of Su Muhua's heart was blown into pieces. Even his bones were shattered and scattered. However, he had no blood. Even his heart was blown away. A look of pain flashed across his face. However, he became a little sluggish. He slowly lowered his head and looked at the left side of his heart. There was no more there. It was empty. Everyone's attention was focused there. At the same time, there was a trace of joy in their hearts. The sword was so overbearing. It seemed like it had succeeded. If that was the case, then the bitterness was over and the sweetness was about to come. They also felt that since Su Muhua had suffered such a serious injury, he would definitely not survive. The heart was the most important part of his body. Chapter 1826. Even Princess Mingzhu, who was halfway up the mountain, could not help but have a slight change in her expression. She really did not expect such a situation. This was truly a little inconceivable. The two of them cooperated very well indeed. Similarly, the courage they displayed at the end to fight to the death was invincible, as if they were fearless. They did not care about how serious their injuries would be either. What they wanted was to cause harm to their opponent. As the saying goes, one's loss is another's gain. The more serious the injury, the more advantageous the situation would be for them. Soon, Princess Mingzhu's expression changed. This was because she could feel that although Su Muhua's aura had weakened a lot, it was far from the point of being on the verge of death. Xiaoyang fell limply to the ground, blood flowing out of his mouth. After receiving that punch just now, even that last bit of willpower had been completely shattered. The severity of his injuries was difficult to estimate. Moreover, the medicinal effect of the explosive pill had been completely worn out by now. Therefore, even standing up was very difficult for him. As for Lei Dingtian, he was not in a good state either. Although his body was tough, he could not withstand the huge gap between their realms. Therefore, after that punch, he showed unparalleled fatigue. Although his injuries were not as serious as Xiao Yang's, the ribs in his chest were all broken. Now, the pain caused his face to become even more distorted. Even his hands began to tremble. It was difficult for him to continue fighting in his exhaustion. Luo Ku looked at the current situation, and the joy in his heart became more and more excited. Everything was finally going to be settled. In the end, it was just a false alarm. They did not completely fall into a hopeless situation. Perhaps this could be considered a blessing in disguise. However, Shen Wushuang and Luo Rong did not look too good. They would not deny Xiao Yang's strength. However, Su Muhua was also very powerful. Her ability far surpassed everyone here. Even when Princess Mingzhu was at her peak, she was no match for him. Sorrow began to spread in their hearts. They could be said to have done their best in this conspiracy. They even took care of every detail to the extreme. However, the result was still unsatisfactory. This made people feel very helpless as well. Soon, Su Muhua suddenly moved. He looked at everyone with disdain, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. You are indeed powerful, but so what? If it had been before, then I would have definitely died here. But now I am immortal. As soon as he said this, Luo Ku and Yang Sun's eyes were filled with doubt. This was something that they had not expected. What was going on? Could it be that Su Muhua was still alive after suffering such serious injuries? Xiao Yang and Lei Dingtian looked at each other and smiled. They had done their best. Who would have thought that it would end up like this? He couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable in his heart. In his heart, he felt extremely uncomfortable. Do you still have more explosion pills? Lei Dingtian forced himself to stand up and asked in a trembling voice. Lei Dingtian was unwilling to resign himself to his fate. Moreover, he felt that if he used the pill to recover, then he still had a chance. As for the aftereffects of the pill, he couldn't care less about it now. After all, compared to his own life, those could be put aside. Xiao Yang smiled bitterly and shook his head. It wasn't that he didn't have any more explosion pills, but even if he gave it to him now, it wouldn't make much sense. This was because there was no way to reverse the current situation. Therefore, he didn't want to give it to him anymore. Moreover, if Lei Dingtian consumed it, it would be quite troublesome. After all, continuously consuming it would hurt his foundation. Suddenly, Lei Dingtian's expression became much more desolate. However, on second thought, it was normal that there weren't many of such miraculous pills. Haha, so what if you have more? Do you really think that you can reverse the situation? Su Muhua said coldly with disdain. After she finished speaking, Su Muhua took a deep breath. Immediately, the surrounding black gas quickly surged over. The deathly aura gathered at the hole in Su Muhua's chest and repaired the missing part at an extremely fast speed. Soon, the hole was completely covered by the deathly aura. In a flash, flesh and bones appeared, and it was restored to its original state. It was as if he had never suffered any eye injuries before. Just looking at him was enough to make one feel shocked and incredulous. The hope that rose in everyone's heart disappeared without a trace at this moment. In fact, they were in complete despair. It could be said that after Su Muhua became the tomb keeper, she had lost the opportunity to pursue the Great Way. However, as long as she was in the tomb of the god of sin, as long as she couldn't be killed directly, she was immortal. There were gains and losses and vice versa. Therefore, Su Muhua could rely on this to do whatever she wanted. Princess Mingzhu stood up with difficulty, since Xiao Yang and Lei Dingtian couldn't fight anymore. Even if she hadn't recovered much of her strength, she still had to make a move. When she sensed that the woman was about to attack again, Su Muhua still acted as if nothing had happened. She was just an arrow at the end of its flight. Even now, there was still no way to change the situation. It would just take a little more effort and a little more effort. That was all. At this moment, Bai Jian stood up as well. He knew very well that although he didn't see any chance of victory, he had to stand up at this time. He would rather die in a bitter battle than stretch his neck out to be killed. Dying like that would be too humiliating. At the same time, he couldn't accept that he would face such an outcome. Li Chuanyi seemed to have sensed his senior brother's thoughts. He stood up slowly with a sharp sword in his hand. It was just death. What was there to be afraid of? However, no matter what the final outcome was, they definitely couldn't wait for death to come. Immediately, Unrivaled God and Luo Rong understood that they had recovered quite well during this period. Therefore, they still had some strength left to fight. At this moment, Xiao Yang looked at Su Muhua and said with a smile, "It's not too late if you leave now. Otherwise, at that time, you'll suffer the miserable fate of having your body and soul obliterated. That would truly be bad." Chapter 1827. Hearing this, Su Muhua laughed as well. He looked down at the young man who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. He wondered if this person's brain had been damaged by him, and now he had lost his mind. So, in such a hopeless situation, he still dared to threaten? It was really a little too funny. So Su Muhua also laughed very happily, because to him, this person was extremely powerful in terms of both strength and mentality. Unfortunately, no matter how much he drank, he couldn't withstand the immense pressure and lost his mind in the end. Therefore, this could be considered to be an extremely normal thing, and it wasn't at all surprising. Lei Dingtian glanced at Xiao Yang and frowned slightly. He was also thinking, could it be that Xiao Yang still had some tricks up his sleeve? If he really had something up his sleeve, he would have taken it out a long time ago. Why would he keep it until now? Bai Jian, on the other hand, looked very confused because he felt that the current situation was indeed different. He felt that Xiao Yang was not someone who would speak without thinking at this juncture. At least, under such circumstances, he wouldn't speak nonsense. Seeing how happy Su Muhua was, Xiao Yang shook his head and laughed bitterly. He was telling the truth, but he didn't believe him and even treated it as a joke. Previously, Xiao Yang had no choice but to exchange injury for injury. He wanted to try and, of course, to buy time. But now, there was naturally no need to continue waiting. This was because Xiao Hua had completely swallowed the black fire and his strength had increased tremendously. Moreover, this was the only reason why Xiao Yang dared to challenge Su Muhua. This was where his confidence came from. Although it was very dangerous, it was fortunate that he made it in time. Therefore, on this point, Xiao Yang was confident that he would win. Su Muhua, on the other hand, looked at the crazy young man. He wanted to see what kind of special performance this guy had. After all, in the tomb of the god of sin, it was very quiet. Only after 1,000 years would people enter, and only then would it be more lively. Therefore, if he didn't have some fun now, it would be too depressing. If it weren't for the fact that these guys could create too many accidents, Su Muhua would have wanted to slowly play with them. Of course, the biggest reason was Han Fenglu's death. That was why his heart was filled with such a strong killing intent. Bai Jian, on the other hand, looked at Xiao Yang with anticipation. From his point of view, this person would definitely not disappoint him. Therefore, he also wanted to know what would happen next. A flame flashed and disappeared. A wisp of flame rose and formed a raging inferno in the blink of an eye. After Xiaohua appeared, it began to swim around happily. Due to the fact that he had to digest the black fire, this period of time was even more unbearable. He even had to endure the occasional counterattack from the black fire, which could be said to be very sullen. Now that everything was finally done, how could it not be excited? Suddenly, he also felt an extremely disgusted aura, which quickly locked onto Su Muhua. At this moment, his aura was not concealed in the slightest, as it completely erupted. It could be said that he was flaunting his might. Immediately, Su Muhua's expression changed drastically. The reason for that was because he did indeed feel threatened. He also did not expect Xiao Yang to have such a trick up his sleeve. The way Lei Dingtian and the rest looked at Xiao Yang changed again. This was something that he did not expect. He did not expect that he still had such a trump card. Not to mention Lei Dingtian. Even Bai Jian had never seen Xiaohua before. Therefore, he was very confused, but he was soon overjoyed. If that was the case, then killing Su Muhua was no longer an extravagant hope. It could be said that the wisp of flame was where their hope lay. Princess Mingzhu, who was standing halfway up the mountain, frowned slightly when she saw the flame. Then she seemed very relaxed. That was because she could clearly feel that the heavenly flame was at least comparable to the existence of the 9th level. Moreover, the heavenly flame was not ordinary. It was a very pure flame, so its destructive power to the tomb keeper was much stronger than that of Xiaoyang and Lei Dingtian. Go. Xiaoyang said in a low voice and pointed at Su Muhua. After receiving the order, Xiaohua immediately pounced on Su Muhua. It could be said that Xiaohua was very eager to devour Su Muhua. That was because after devouring Black Flame, Xiaohua also obtained Black Flame's ability to devour everything with spirit to nourish himself and make himself stronger. Although Xiaohua had that kind of ability, its nature was still relatively docile. He would not be like Black Flame, who only wanted to devour everything to strengthen himself. Without his master's order, Xiaohua would never act recklessly. Seeing Xiaohua pounce on him, Su Muhua was completely flustered. He growled, and the deathly aura in his body spread out wildly, obviously trying to block Xiaohua. However, how could the deathly aura be blocked? Wherever Xiaohua passed, the deathly aura was burned to nothing. It could not withstand a single blow. It was like a defeated army collapsing. The deathly aura could not withstand such a strong attack. In a flash, Xiaohua was in front of Su Muhua. He wanted to escape, but he did not have the chance. Xiaohua was like a maggot in a tarsal bone. He landed on Su Muhua's body and quickly covered him, ready to devour him. It was extremely cruel. After witnessing this scene, everyone was extremely shocked. This heavenly flame was a little too unreasonable, wasn't it? It directly pounced forward and started burning. Wasn't this a little too overbearing? Especially Lei Dingtian. When he fought with Su Muhua just now, it could be said that he had exhausted all his skills. In the end, all he could do was hit the flesh with his fists. However, the heavenly flame was really unreasonable. It just beat him up. Su Muhua kept running away like a man on fire. However, it did not have the slightest effect. He could not shake off Xiaohua's attack. Even if he gathered the deathly aura to defend himself, it did not have the slightest effect. As the attributes were completely restrained, the deathly aura dissipated immediately when it reached him. It could not form a huge force to push him away. Screams of agony were endless. Su Muhua never thought that he would face such a miserable situation. The incomparably scorching pain caused his divine soul to undergo an extraordinary refinement, causing him unbearable pain. Chapter 1828. Looking at Su Muhua, who was being burned by the flames, Lei Dingtian's heart was filled with sadness. A genius of a generation who had lost himself in the tomb of the god of sin and eventually became a tomb keeper. He was originally close to the great Tao, but he never thought that he would go further and further away and go astray. Now he had to endure such torment without being able to resist. What made Lei Dingtian feel even worse was that the current situation was very unbearable for him. The reason was very simple. It was because Xiaoyang still had such a trump card. It would be very difficult to kill him in the future. Although there was a chance of survival now, Lei Dingtian was not happy at all because he did not know when he would be able to take revenge. The heavenly fire alone was comparable to the upper level 9, and this was regardless of Xiaoyang's strength. Xiaoyang was able to fight him to a draw without using the heavenly fire. If he used it, would he not lose? The more he thought about it, the more upset Lei Dingtian felt. It was unbearable. On the other hand, Shen Wushuang and the rest were overjoyed because to them, this was a great chance of survival. As long as Su Muhua died, everything would be over. Then they would be able to enter the Heaven Peak Mountain and comprehend the opportunities within. By then, the benefits that they could obtain would depend on their luck. If they were lucky, it was not impossible for them to soar to the top. Therefore, they were looking forward to the changes that would happen next. The happiest person was Bai Jian. Before entering the tomb of the god of sin, he was very worried that Xiaoyang would encounter Lei Dingtian. If he could not win, his life would be in danger. However, now that he had such a trump card, he naturally did not have to be afraid of Lei Dingtian. At least, he had the power to protect himself. Su Muhua was not satisfied at the moment, so he kept fighting back. He hoped that he could break the stalemate and change everything. At the very least, he wanted to get rid of this strange heavenly fire. However, no matter how hard he tried, the results were still unsatisfactory. That was because there was practically no difference between Xiaohua and the maggot in one's bones. It was simply impossible to get rid of him. Moreover, after Su Muhua became the tomb keeper, she cultivated the techniques of this place, which caused the power in her body to change. Under such a natural restraint, how could he escape? If she used her spiritual energy, then Su Muhua would naturally be able to shake her off. However, his spiritual power had already turned into the power of death and was naturally restrained. He did not have the slightest ability to fight back. Xiaoyang watched to prevent any accidents from happening. However, when he discovered that Xiaohua had completely suppressed it, he sat down at ease. He consumed a few pills and began to recover from his injuries and strength, although Su Muhua had been completely suppressed by the current threat. Moreover, with Lil Flame's protection, he could sit back and relax, but he didn't dare to be so casual. If something unexpected were to happen at that time, it would be really bad. Sometimes, the more one was reborn after a calamity, the more careful one had to be in order to avoid any unbearable accidents, especially now that Lei Dingtian was right in front of him. Previously, in order to deal with the people of the Greenly world together, they had chosen to overcome the difficulties and fight side by side. However, after the calamity, the grudges between them still existed. When the time came and he started to cause trouble, what would happen? Therefore, Xiaoyang had to be on guard against these problems. Sometimes, it was not a bad thing to be careful. Therefore, Xiaoyang was very clear that there were many changes in the tomb of the god of sin, and there were many things that could not be predicted. Caution was the parent of safety. This was the logic behind it. Seeing this, Lei Dingtian immediately sat down cross-legged and swallowed some elixirs. The two of them seemed to have a tacit understanding. They were both wary of each other, so they did not dare to let down their guard. If they were the slightest bit careless and really fell into the other party's trap, it would be too late for regrets. Previously, the biggest threat, Su Muhua, seemed to have been completely ignored by the two of them. They did not even look at her. Bai Jian, on the other hand, noticed this subtle movement, and his expression changed immediately. If one were to think about it carefully, what Xiaoyang had done was only to kill Lei Dingyin and Tian Bianu. However, the destruction of the Thousand Thunder Palace was completely caused by him, Bai Jian. Back then, it was Bai Jian who had led the group of several small worlds to attack the Thousand Thunder Realm. If it had been before, Bai Jian naturally would not have been afraid of Lei Dingtian. However, he was really too tired now, so he had to be more careful. That was the only way to be more secure. Shen Wushuang and Luo Rong seemed to have completely forgotten what had happened in the Thousand Thunder Realm. Therefore, they did not notice the sudden abnormality of these three people at all. However, their respect for these people did not diminish at all. This was because they knew very well that if these people had not fought with all their might, they would have been attacked by the death aura and become dead spirits. However, Princess Mingzhu, who was sitting halfway up the mountain, noticed this subtle change, and her expression changed slightly. She was also aware of some of the grudges that had happened before, and she remembered them very clearly. As Lei Dingtian was someone who was valued by the God Realm, it was inevitable that he would have seen some information. Later on, at the Jade Pool banquet, she felt that Xiaoyang was rather interesting, so she also paid attention to him. Therefore, the grudge that seemed to have formed without any contact at all made people feel a little helpless. Princess Mingzhu naturally knew this very well. They could let bygones be bygones before, but after everything had calmed down it was hard to say. Therefore, she was a little worried. Could it be that at this point the battle still had to continue? At this moment, the screams finally stopped. Su Muhua's body had been burned to ashes, and even his god soul had been swallowed by Xiaohua. In this world, Su Muhua could be considered to have disappeared forever. He had lost everything in the tomb of the god of sin. At this moment, Xiaohua lazily returned to Xiaoyang's side and even burped, looking charmingly naive. However, those people who saw this naive look could not bring themselves to laugh at all. This thing ate people without spitting out the bones. Chapter 1829. Xiao Yang smiled in satisfaction as he looked at Xiaohua, who appeared to be simple and honest. Sure enough, this fellow did not disappoint him. He did not expect it to be able to obtain the power of the black fire. This was not easy. In the future, if he wanted to upgrade it, he would not have to go through so much trouble to find the heavenly fire. Although Xiao Yang knew Xiaohua's nature very well, he still carefully sensed its emotions. If its temperament was affected by the black fire, then the situation would become very bad. By then, the stronger Xiaohua was, the greater the hidden danger. If the black fire calamity appeared again, it would be much more terrifying than before. Fortunately, Xiaohua did not seem to be affected. This could be considered a good thing. Xiao Yang was very satisfied with this. In this case, it could be considered a good ending. All right, go back and digest it. Xiao Yang smiled and raised his hand. Xiaohua also plunged into Xiao Yang's sleeve and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the scorching heat also disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. Xiao Yang smiled and nodded. This kind of ending wasn't too bad. At least, they did not suffer any major losses. This could be considered a good thing. However, he did not know what Lei Dingtian was thinking now. When would they settle their scores? Suddenly, after feeling the gaze on him, Lei Dingtian frowned slightly and stood up immediately. This was because, in Lei Dingtian's opinion, Xiao Yang now had the power to decide the outcome of the battle. At this time, it was very likely that he would attack and kill him to the last man. However, Lei Dingtian was not the type to stretch his neck out and wait for death. In the previous battle with Su Muhua, he had made it very clear that he would rather die in battle than wait for death to come. After feeling the other party's fighting spirit, Xiao Yang's expression changed. If Lei Dingtian really wanted to fight, there was nothing he could do about it. For a time, it could be said that the situation had changed, and the two of them once again began to oppose each other. It seemed that the grudge between them was about to be settled. Bai Jian immediately stood up. Since he and Xiao Yang were sworn friends, there was no reason for him to back out now. Thus, no matter what, he had to make a move. Luo Rong felt that it was strange. Why did the situation become so tense at this moment? Could it be that they had ulterior motives? On the other hand, unrivaled God's expression changed again. At this moment, Princess Mingzhu slowly stood up. She shook her head, helplessly, and sighed. She didn't think that there was still no way to avoid this matter. However, was it worth it to continue the war? Both of them were exhausted, and their spiritual energies were almost depleted. Even if they fought forcefully, they might not be able to gain much of an advantage over the other party. Previously, they had gone through life and death together, but now they had to fight again. It was really unpredictable. Princess Mingzhu took a step forward and walked halfway up the mountain. She landed between Xiao Yang and Lei Dingtian. She looked at Xiao Yang, who was covered in blood, and saw that his body was still trembling because of broken bones. She found it funny. His body was clearly unable to bear the burden and was unable to endure any longer. Yet, he still had to put on an act. Lei Dingtian was not in a hurry to make a move. Instead, he looked at the pure white figure. Can't you put aside the grudge between the two of you for a while? It won't be too late to settle it after we leave the tomb of the god of sin. Princess Mingzhu said slowly after thinking for a while. Xiao Yang and Lei Dingtian did not say a word because they did not know what the other party meant. Therefore, they would not make a rash statement. Bai Jian, on the other hand, yawned and looked nonchalant. He looked sloppy, but he was prepared. Once he made a move, he would draw his sword as fast as he could. Xin Wushuang, on the other hand, did not say a word. In his opinion, since Princess Mingzhu had spoken to put the matter aside for the time being, there was naturally no problem. There was no need for him to worry about anything. Luo Rong, on the other hand, smiled helplessly. The grudge between them had made the situation strange. However, in his opinion, the two of them did not find a chance to make things difficult for each other. Moreover, when they were fighting Sumuhua together, they helped each other block the attacks. Their cooperation was flawless. Therefore, their natures were similar, and they were able to distinguish everything clearly. It was just that now they needed a way out. However, a way out created by Princess Mingzhu was really something. Moreover, it had the weight to make them put aside the grudge between them for the time being. Even if the two of you fight now, you won't be able to fight to your heart's content. So why do you have to do this? Princess Mingzhu said helplessly. The atmosphere was still tense. The two of them did not conceal their aura. Their eyes seemed to have gone past Princess Mingzhu in the middle as they stared at each other. As long as one of them acted rashly, they would attack immediately. Princess Mingzhu was feeling rather helpless now. The grudge between the two of them was indeed difficult to explain. Moreover, she did not know that Xiao Yang and Lei Dingtian had already fought before. Indeed, I can't force the two of you to let go of the grudge. However, we were comrades who fought side by side just now. We went through life and death together. Therefore, I won't say much. I don't want to see the two of you fight before we leave the tomb of the god of sin. Princess Mingzhu's tone suddenly changed as she spoke. She looked at the young man, still unmoved. Then, Princess Mingzhu stabbed her sword into the ground. If the two of you fight, don't blame me for being merciless. Once we're out of the god realm, you can fight however you want. It has nothing to do with me. However, you have to listen to me here. Princess Mingzhu scolded. Previously, Princess Mingzhu wanted to persuade the two of them gently. However, she realized that she was not good at this. Therefore, she, who was in a high position, did not intend to persuade them with a humble tone. Instead, she did things her own way. Thus, at this moment, his majestic and domineering aura was completely revealed. She was still the high and mighty Princess Mingzhu. Chapter 1830. Unrivaled God. New Princess. Mingzhu very well. Naturally, he knew that if she said it, she would be able to do it. Therefore, if the two of them were to fight, the first enemy they would face would be her. Bai Jian, on the other hand, frowned slightly. Princess Mingzhu's interference had made the matter a little more complicated. Therefore, whether or not they should fight now was a headache. They did not know what to do. At this moment, Xin Jinyi slowly woke up. He had no idea what had happened before this. However, when he woke up and saw the scene before him, he was very confused. He glanced at the surrounding situation. It could be said that it was a scene of devastation. It was obvious that they had gone through a very fierce battle to form such a situation. However, no one knew how intense the battle was. Lei Dingtian clenched his fists. He knew very well that since Princess Mingzhu had spoken, if he were to fight, he would not be giving her face. When that happens, it would be hard for him not to lose face. Therefore, he did not know what to do. Xiao Yang, on the other hand, was the first to curb his desire to fight. He smiled at Princess Mingzhu to show that he understood. Actually, from the beginning, Xiao Yang was not prepared to fight. He just had to be on guard. However, he did not expect Lei Dingtian's desire to fight to be so strong. Since things had turned out this way, what harm was there in not fighting? Of course, this was not because Xiao Yang was afraid of trouble. It was just that he was in someone else's territory and he had to listen to their arrangements. Moreover, There was no conflict between Xiaoyang and Lei Dingtian. Therefore, he could let it go. Furthermore, the battle with Su Muhua earlier was something that he greatly appreciated. If they could let go of their grudges and become friends, that would be fine for Xiaoyang. However, to Lei Dingtian that was impossible, because he was the one who had lost his family, not Xiaoyang. However, if he were to stop now, it would be the wisest choice for Lei Dingtian. He knew very well that Xiaoyang had the heavenly fire, and that was enough to defeat him. Moreover, Xiaoyang still had Bai Jian as a helper. If he were to rashly start a battle, he would be at a disadvantage no matter what. He glanced at the holy lightning hammer in his hand and sighed helplessly. He knew that if it weren't for the fact that Xiaoyang trusted him, he wouldn't have taken out the holy lightning hammer to make a deal with him. It could be said that after the previous battle, they had begun to appreciate each other. However, it was a pity that the world made fools of people. It was impossible for them to become friends. Lei Dingtian put the holy lightning hammer away. If Xiaoyang didn't make a move, then he naturally wouldn't either. Seeing the two of them put away their weapons, everyone secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Bai Jian did not mind. Since Xiaoyang had the ability to protect himself, there was no need to mention him. Therefore, whether or not he killed Lei Dingtian now seemed to be somewhat irrelevant. Although the two of them did not speak, they both restrained themselves. Princess Mingzhu already knew what was going on. They could let it go, but they couldn't say it out loud. Honorable Sky Inch of Heaven Peak Mountain was killed by everyone's concerted efforts. Therefore, everyone can enter and comprehend the opportunities inside. As for how much you can obtain, it will depend on your own opportunities. Princess Mingzhu said indifferently. It could be said that all of them had almost died here, all for the sake of the opportunities inside. Luo Rong also stood up slowly. He looked at the towering mountain, and the smile on his face grew wider. If he could obtain the opportunity inside, it would naturally be a great thing. However, he realized that no one was moving. Instead, they were sitting on the ground and recovering their injuries and strength. Luo Rong sat on the ground. He wasn't in a hurry to enter, so he sat down as well. Although the opportunities in Heaven Peak Mountain were very tempting, they still knew the severity of the situation. If their mental state was unstable due to their injuries, it was possible for them to go berserk. That was also the reason why they didn't enter Heaven Peak Mountain immediately to comprehend the opportunities. Sometimes it was better to be safe, especially at their level. Even a small mistake could lead to a huge crack. In the end, it was very likely that it would go out of control. In an instant, the world regained its previous peace and was no longer as noisy as before. Xiaoyang wasn't in a hurry either. He began to count the treasures left behind by Han Fenglu. He realized that other than the tiger tooth guillotine blade and the emerald green bamboo cane, the rest of his collection was not bad. In particular, there were a lot of Dharma weapons for self-defense, which happened to fill the gap that had been shattered previously. Among them, there were also many elixirs. Han Fenglu was the #1 genius in the Greenly world. Naturally, he was highly valued. There were also many benefits that could be obtained. Due to the great plan this time, they were well prepared. Xiaoyang was very satisfied with the bountiful harvest. As for the method to control people, he also found it. However, the method was very inferior because it required certain items to be controlled, and it couldn't achieve the effect of one's heart's desire. For example, Song Zhongling had poisoned the barbecued meat previously, which was why it was subtly affected. However, Xiaoyang was the ancestor of using poison, so he discovered it early. Not only could he control it, but he also concocted the antidote. In other words, the method was only an inferior method of refining poison. It wasn't very perfect. To others, it might be making the best use of everything or was of little value. However, to Xiaoyang it was a little different. If he could improve it, it might be of great help to him in the future. At this moment, Xiaoyang also began to study it. The things recorded in it were very simple for Xiaoyang. He could completely grasp it in less than an hour. However, if he wanted to improve it to a perfect state, it would be quite troublesome. Xiaoyang was not in a hurry. He was just itching to try it out. This kind of method was somewhat unkind, but it was also possible to use it in case of an emergency. Sometimes it was indeed impossible to make the best use of everything that was learned. However, there was naturally no harm in having an additional skill. That was the principle of having more skills. Sometimes learning more things might give one more chance of survival. Chapter 1831. The Zenith Mountain had always been venerable 1 Cun Tian's territory. Ever since its demise, the surrounding dead spirits were controlled by Han Fenglu to deal with Xiaoyang and the others, but they were all killed. Therefore, although the place had become ownerless, not a single dead spirit dared to invade. Although their intelligence wasn't very high, they knew that the strongest one would only end up with a broken halberd in the hands of these outsiders. If they rashly came, only death would await them. Therefore, they didn't dare to offend them. Everything returned to its previous dead silence. It was like a pool of stagnant water, and there was no change at all. Everything became extremely quiet. Although everyone was concerned about the opportunities in the mountain, they did not act rashly. Right now, their injuries could be said to be very serious. There were even some flaws in their state of mind. If they took a wrong path at that time, they might be consigned to eternal damnation once their thoughts changed. In fact, it was very possible for him to become a tombkeeper here. Therefore, even Princess Mingzhu, who was blessed by the heavens, didn't dare to enter the mountain to search for fortune. This was because she knew very well that the greater the opportunity, the more careful one had to be. There could not be any mistakes. Over time, their injuries and mental states began to gradually recover, and they were no longer as miserable as they were before. After a long time, Princess Mingzhu stepped forward and took the lead to enter the Zenith Mountain. She was ready to look for her own opportunities. Since Princess Mingzhu went first, Luo Rong and Luo Ku went in after a while. They had long wanted to go in and take a look, but because of their relationship, they did not dare to be the first to take the lead. Although Luo Rong had put in a lot of effort to deal with Venerable 1 Cun Tian, he blamed himself for not being able to help during Qing Li's incident. Gradually, their injuries were more or less healed. They felt that they could go in, so they gradually entered the Zenith Mountain. One after another, the people there entered one after another. They did not continue to waste time there. Xiaoyang and Lei Dingtian's injuries were the most serious, so they were still recuperating and did not follow in. Although Lei Dingtian's injuries were not as severe as Xiaoyang's, his state of mind was in quite a bit of trouble. And the reason for all of this was because of Xiaoyang's strength, which caused a flaw to appear in his mental state. Xiaoyang did not mind. He only felt that he was very tired now. His current state was not suitable for comprehending. Therefore, after thinking for a while, he fell to the ground and started snoring. As for Lei Dingtian, the way he saw it, since the other party had already agreed to settle the score after leaving the firmament, there was no way the other party would resort to such despicable means to ambush him. It was just like when Lei Dingtian had obtained the Holy Thunder Hammer, the detoxification elixir, and the explosive elixir. He had made this deal. He had not attacked them behind their backs or added insult to injury. Instead, he had fought side by side with them. From this, it could be seen that this person's character was completely trustworthy. Furthermore, it was necessary to be on guard when dealing with villains. However, for Lei Dingtian, there was no need for that. When Lei Dingtian opened his eyes and saw Xiaoyang sleeping on the ground, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This person was truly carefree and unguarded. This is not bad. After a big dream, any state of mind will improve. Lei Dingtian mumbled. He also fell to the ground and closed his eyes to rest. To cultivators, sleeping was completely unnecessary. All they needed to do was to circulate their spiritual energy, and they would become much more awake. However, when one was extremely tired, deep sleep had an extraordinary effect. Though these two were life and death enemies, they both fell asleep without being on guard. They did not care about anything else. If it weren't for the fact that this place was filled with the aura of death, it would be a peaceful place. It would not be filled with murderous intent. As time passed, Xiaoyang woke up as well. Because he had a good sleep, his energy was much more energetic. He slowly got up and saw that Lei Dingtian was also sleeping. He bitterly smiled and shook his head. Then, he did not stop himself from entering. Instead, he headed straight to the heaven's peak. Now that he had almost recovered, he could go in and give it a try. Perhaps if he was lucky, he would be able to obtain some good things. That was hard to say. As for Lei Dingtian, he did not need to worry about him. He was a cultivator of the Thousand Thunders realm and had the protection of the thunderclouds. He did not need to worry about anything happening. Even if some blind, undead spirit came to invade, the final result would probably be to be annihilated into ashes. After entering the heaven's peak, he looked around and saw many smooth stone walls. On the stone walls, many words were carved. This place was no different from other places. It was all created by the God's will. It was impossible to understand these things literally. One could only rely on luck to understand them. If you can understand them, then they are yours. Nobody can take them away from you. If they were unlucky, they might end up with nothing at all. That was a very normal thing. It was not strange at all. After walking a few steps, Xiaoyang saw Li Chuini sitting in front of a stone wall, trying to comprehend something. It was obvious that he gained something by chance. That was why he was so focused. Seeing this, Xiaoyang decided to lighten his footsteps to prevent any noise from disturbing him. As he continued to walk, he gradually saw Yang Sun and Luo Ku. They were also sitting there, focused on comprehending. However, if someone could enter a state of mind, then others might not be so lucky. Shen Jinyi sat in a corner, looking anxious and restless. His eyes were fixed on the stone wall, as if he wanted to eat all the words. It could be said that he looked quite ferocious. Although people from the realm of the gods would be favored in the tomb of the gods, it was also about fate. If fate didn't allow it, even if you widen your eyes, it would be useless. Therefore, like Shen Jinyi, no matter how hard he tried, it would not be of much use. It was because his mental state was simply too terrible. That was why it was like this. If he was not anxious, the situation would be much better. Sometimes, the more anxious you are, the more you need to be calm. Xiaoyang smiled faintly and continued walking. This was just a corridor. The things inside were the main show.